They had fought beside him for 3 years. They had pulled him out of crossfire more times than he could count. Then, in the same second, every one of them turned and pointed a weapon straight at his chest, and not one of them looked sorry about it. It wasn't only him. Across 100 different worlds, the exact same thing happened to commanders just like him, at the exact same moment, with no warning at all. Different planets, different battles. The same order reached every soldier's ear within seconds of each other, and not one of them hesitated before pulling the trigger. By the time the sun came up over the capital the next morning, the temple at its center was on fire. Its tallest tower had already cracked down the middle. Smoke covered the sky in thick black clouds, and the ships that should have been guarding it were flying away instead, as fast as they could go. No one watching that morning could explain how an order 3,000 years old had fallen apart in a single night. The real answer didn't start that morning. It started 900 years earlier, on a forest moon most maps don't bother naming anymore. The war there had gone on so long that soldiers stopped counting the battles. Trees that once covered the valleys were burned down to black stumps. 2 armies faced each other across the ash, and both sides knew the next fight would be the last one. It had to be. Nothing was left to fight with after this. A general named Hoth led one side. He was old for a soldier, his body worn down by years of holding a line that kept almost breaking. Thousands of fighters stood behind him, tired, in a way that sleep couldn't fix anymore. They had been told for years that one more battle would end the war their grandparents had started. Most of them stopped believing that a long time ago. They kept fighting anyway, because stopping felt worse than continuing. Across the valley stood the army Hoth had spent years trying to destroy. It had once been one group, united under a single idea. Years of fighting and arguing had split it into smaller pieces, each one turning on the others. Its leader watched the battlefield that morning, already knowing something most of his soldiers didn't. His side was losing. It had been losing for months, and losing slowly was starting to feel worse than losing fast. A few nights before that final battle, an argument broke out inside his command tent. One of his warriors, younger than most and known for speaking too freely, told him the plan he'd chosen was a mistake. He said it wasn't a way to win the war. It was a way to make sure no one survived to claim they'd won it. His commander didn't like hearing that. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. By the end of the night, the younger warrior was thrown out of camp, stripped of his rank, told never to return. He didn't argue. He just walked out into a forest that was still smoking from weeks of fighting. That argument may have saved his life. The battle the next morning pushed both armies into a narrow stretch of burned ground. Hoth's side believed they were close to finally winning. What they didn't know, what almost no one on either side knew, was that the enemy commander had no plan to surrender. He had built something else instead, not a weapon that fired, a weapon that pulled. It was built to gather every drop of dark power on that battlefield and turn it back on everyone standing near it, all at once. He wasn't trying to win the battle anymore. He was trying to make sure that whoever survived it would have nothing left worth calling a victory. The weapon went off without any warning at all. There was no fire, no explosion the way soldiers expected one to look. Just a wave of silence that swept across the valley, like the whole world holding its breath and letting it go at the same time. Thousands of fighters on both sides, soldiers, commanders, masters and students alike, simply stopped, not wounded, not falling back. Got between one breath and the next, like something deep inside them had been switched off. Lord Hoth was one of them. So was almost every commander who had spent the war believing his cause was worth dying for. The young warrior, thrown out of camp 2 nights before, was not. He felt the wave from far away. It moved through the trees like cold water, brushing past him without pulling him in. He stopped walking. He turned back toward the battle he'd just been kicked out of, And for a long moment he didn't move at all. The only war he had ever known had just ended without him in it. When survivors finally reached the crater days later, almost no one was left standing. Both armies had been wiped out in a single moment. The enemy side, in particular, was gone completely. Its leaders were dead. Its fighters were dead. Decades of ambition had ended in 1 second, on one forest moon, and the people sorting through the wreckage assumed, reasonably, that the danger itself had ended too. Word reached the capital within days. The leaders there declared the war over. Crowds gathered in the streets to celebrate. Statues were planned. Speeches were given. The few surviving Jedi, worn down by years of fighting, allowed themselves to believe, for the first time in a long while, that the fighting was truly finished. No one searched for survivors on the losing side. Why would they? The weapon that ended the battle had clearly done its job. The official report written that month said the enemy order had wiped itself out completely, taking its ideas and its bloodline down with it. The matter was closed. As far as the capital was concerned, that chapter of history was already finished. The young warrior who walked out of camp 2 nights before the end never came back to correct anyone. He kept walking instead. Through a forest still settling into ash, past a battlefield that would soon turn into a memorial no one visited twice. He had no soldiers behind him, no title, no order following him anywhere. What he carried was one quiet idea, sharpened by everything he had just watched happen. The old way had failed, not because it lacked strength, because it never learned how to hide. A large order could be found. A loud order could be hunted down and ended in a single morning, exactly like the one behind him just had been. He understood that now, in a way, no teaching ever explained to him. If anything like his cause was going to survive past this season of bonfires and victory speeches, it would need to become smaller, quieter, patient enough to wait through decades the rest of the galaxy would spend forgetting to be afraid. He told no one this. There was no one left to tell. Far off in the capital, the celebrations went on late into the night. Flags hung from government buildings. Children too young to remember how the war started were told it was finally over, completely, forever. The remaining Jedi leaders, tired and relieved, let themselves believe the danger they had spent generations fighting no longer existed anywhere in the galaxy. They weren't lying to anyone. They just weren't looking in the right direction. Somewhere past the edge of the battle, one survivor kept walking, already shaping a plan that wouldn't need armies, wouldn't need flags, and wouldn't repeat the mistake of being seen before it was ready. The forest behind him went quiet again, the way forests do, once whatever was fighting in them finally stops. The peace that followed lasted longer than anyone alive that night would live to see broken. That was exactly what he was counting on. Years passed before anyone heard from him again. He didn't return to any city. He didn't seek out followers or build a name for himself. Instead, he disappeared into the far edges of the galaxy, places where star charts ran out of detail, and most travelers never bothered going. He spent that time thinking, testing old ideas against new ones, working out exactly what had gone wrong on that forest moon, and exactly how to make sure it never went wrong again. The answer he settled on was simple, even if the discipline behind it was not. Numbers had been the problem. An order with hundreds of members could be tracked, infiltrated, and eventually cornered, the same way a large herd of animals can be hunted down piece by piece. A smaller group could vanish completely. He decided, somewhere in those quiet years, that the surviving tradition would never again have more than 2 members at one time, 1 master, 1 student, nothing larger, ever. That decision would shape everything that came after it. He began searching for candidates not long after. He didn't advertise. He didn't recruit openly. He traveled to backwater settlements and mining colonies, places where strong, untrained instincts in the Force often went unnoticed by anyone official. He gathered a handful of young men and women from these places, brought them together under his teaching, and pushed them harder than any of them expected to survive. Training under him was brutal by design. Lessons were taught through pain, as often as through words. Mistakes were not corrected gently. Several of his students broke under the pressure within the first year, either giving up or dying from the risks he forced them to take. He didn't mourn them. Each failure simply narrowed the field further, which was exactly the point. Among the group that remained, one student stood apart almost immediately. She came from nothing notable, a quiet world most star charts barely listed, where her early life had been ordinary in every way, except for the strength hiding underneath it. She didn't speak much. She rarely complained. What she did instead was watch everyone around her, including her teacher, with a patience that unsettled grown warriors twice her age. Where other students reacted to pain, she studied it. Where others sought his approval, she seemed content simply to outlast them. Her name was Zana. He noticed her early, though he was careful never to show it. Favoritism, in his experience, made students lazy and made masters predictable. Instead, he kept pushing her exactly as hard as the others, watching closely as she absorbed lesson after lesson without complaint, growing sharper instead of more exhausted the way the rest eventually did. The final test came on a cold afternoon, with only a handful of candidates left standing. He gathered them together and told them plainly that only one would walk away from what came next. There would be no second chance offered, no gentler version of the lesson held back for later. Whoever proved strongest would inherit everything he had spent his life rebuilding. Everyone else would not be needed anymore. What followed was short and brutal. Zana moved through the contest with a kind of calm none of the others managed to hold on to, using patience as a weapon in a fight where everyone else relied only on aggression. By the time it ended, she was the only one left breathing. He didn't praise her for it. He simply told her the rule that would govern the rest of her life, and the lives of everyone who would one day follow after her. 2, never more than 2. 1 to hold the power, 1 to crave it, waiting for the day they were strong enough to take it for themselves. That tension, a master always slightly afraid of being replaced, an apprentice always slightly hungry to replace him, was not a flaw in the design. It was the entire design. Fear sharpened the master, hunger sharpened the apprentice. Between the two of them, neither side was ever allowed to grow comfortable enough to make the same mistakes that had ended everything on that forest moon. He gave her a new name to mark the change. From that point forward, in private, she was no longer simply a student learning under him. She had become something else entirely, something that, as far as the rest of the galaxy knew, didn't exist anymore at all. Far away, on the Republic's capital, an entirely different kind of teaching was taking shape. The war that had ended on that scorched moon was no longer spoken about as a recent memory. It had become a lesson, retold in classrooms and ceremonies, polished smoother with every year that passed. New students at the Jedi Temple learned about it the way they learned any other piece of settled history. Names of generals, dates of major battles, a clean and complete ending, delivered without much room left for questions. A monument had been built in the capital not long after the fighting stopped, listing those who died in the final battle. Each year, on the anniversary of the war's end, officials gathered there to give speeches about sacrifice and peace finally earned. The speeches grew shorter every year. Fewer people attended each time. That, too, felt like a kind of victory to those organizing it, proof that the wound had healed enough not to need constant tending anymore. One young Jedi Master, though, never quite settled into that comfort the way his peers had. He had been among those sent to help recover the dead after the final battle, years earlier, walking through a field still smoking, with the aftermath of a weapon no one fully understood. The official report listed every member of the enemy's leadership as accounted for. He had read that report more times than he could count, and something about it had bothered him from the very first reading, though it took him years to put the feeling into words. One name on the enemy side had never been confirmed among the dead. Witnesses agreed the man had been cast out of the enemy camp days before the final battle, banished after some disagreement. No one survived to explain in detail. No body matching his description was ever recovered. The official explanation simply assumed he must have died somewhere outside the search radius, lost to the same weapon that claimed everyone else. The young master wasn't satisfied with assuming. He raised the matter quietly at first, mentioning it to colleagues over shared meals, half expecting someone to share his unease. Instead, he was met mostly with polite agreement, followed by gentle dismissal. The war was over. The enemy's structure had been destroyed completely. One missing body, in a battle that claimed thousands, hardly seemed worth reopening old wounds for. Eventually he brought the concern to a small council of senior masters, laying out exactly what troubled him: the missing name, the convenient assumption, the complete absence of any search conducted beyond the obvious. He wasn't dramatic about it. He simply asked that someone look further before the matter was considered fully closed. The masters listened to him patiently. They thanked him for his diligence. Then they explained, with the calm certainty of people who had already decided the answer, that an enemy reduced to nothing couldn't simply reassemble itself from one missing soldier. Even if the man had somehow survived, he explained, he would have no order left to lead, no students, no resources, nothing but a single set of skills, and a galaxy that had already moved on from fearing him. The young master didn't push further after that. There was nothing left to push against, no evidence, no leads, nothing but a feeling that refused to fully settle, no matter how many times he was reassured. He returned to his usual duties. He continued teaching new students the same official history everyone else taught. In time, even he stopped mentioning it out loud, though the feeling itself never fully left him. That was how the first doubt died. Not through an argument, not through proof one way or the other, through patience, repeated reassurance, and the simple, exhausting difficulty of arguing against a story everyone else had already agreed to believe. Years kept passing after that, the way years do when nothing dramatic happens to mark them. The monument in the capital weathered slightly with each passing season. The annual ceremony shrank further, eventually becoming little more than a formal note in the Senate's calendar. New Padawans grew into knights, without ever meeting anyone who remembered the war firsthand. The story calcified into something closer to legend than history, true in its broad shape, but worn smooth of any sharp edges that might have kept people cautious. Far from any of that, on worlds the Republic's maps barely bothered tracking, a single master continued shaping a single student into something the galaxy had already convinced itself didn't exist anymore. Lessons continued in total privacy. No temples were built, no monuments raised, no ceremonies held to mark anything that happened in that training. That, too, was exactly the point. A peace built on the assumption that danger had been fully erased made room, without anyone choosing it directly, for something to grow quietly in the space. That assumption left unguarded. A peace built on the assumption that danger had been fully erased made room, without anyone choosing it directly, for something to grow quietly in the space. That assumption left unguarded. That space kept growing for 5 centuries. Master taught apprentice. Apprentice became master. Names changed hands in private rooms no historian ever entered, each new pair carrying forward the same rule handed down generations earlier: stay small, stay hidden, never let the count rise above 2. No record exists of most of these handoffs. One pair operated for decades out of a freighter that never registered the same port twice. Another lasted barely long enough for the apprentice to finish her training before claiming the title herself, the way the rule always intended things to work. A third spent their entire partnership on a moon so cold that few outsiders ever bothered visiting, training in private while the rest of the galaxy carried on without the faintest idea anything of consequence was happening there at all. The calendars changed too. Somewhere along the way calendars always do, when enough time passes, without anyone deciding to stop it. The years that once counted forward from a battle were eventually counted forward from something else entirely. A renewal of the Republic's founding charter, signed with great ceremony 2 centuries after the war, that no longer needed remembering by date. People in the capital that era spoke of charter years instead of war years, and most of them couldn't have said, if asked directly, what the old counting system had even been measuring. By the time 500 years had passed since the forest moon, almost no one alive remembered that war as anything more than a story told in classrooms. The Republic had grown larger, richer, and far more confident than it had ever been. Trade routes stretched across more systems than any single census had managed to count accurately over a decade. Starships built that era moved faster and carried more cargo than anything from the war years. Built for commerce instead of combat, their hulls smooth and unarmored, in a way no military designer from 5 centuries earlier would have considered wise. Senate sessions ran longer than ever, filled now with arguments over tariffs and shipping contracts, instead of troop movements and casualty reports. The galaxy had settled into something it was happy to call permanent peace, and after 5 centuries of nothing proving that wrong, most citizens had simply stopped asking whether the label still fit. This was the settled galaxy, as people of that era liked to call it. Old war talk, the kind that filled history texts and anniversary speeches, had become something close to background noise. Present, technically, but rarely listened to closely by anyone with somewhere else to be. Even the Force itself seemed to share in that quiet. Jedi of the era described it as calm, in a way older records never quite matched, undisturbed for so long that most serving knights had never personally felt it shift in anger at all. A few older masters occasionally mentioned a faint unease they couldn't explain, a kind of background hum beneath the stillness. But they rarely pressed the point. Stillness, after 5 centuries, was simply what the Force was assumed to feel like now. The Jedi Order had settled into this new shape just as thoroughly as everyone else. Where Jedi once led armies, they now sat on tribunals. Where they once trained for open combat as their primary skill, they now spent years studying negotiation, contract law, and the careful art of standing between 2 furious delegations without letting either side feel humiliated. Temple halls that had once echoed with the sound of practice blades now more often echoed with quieter sounds instead. Recitations of trade code, debates over interpretation of old treaties, the low murmur of students memorizing diplomatic protocol instead of battle formations. The training yards that once filled with sparring pairs had been converted, in more than one wing of the temple, into reading rooms and archive halls. This was simply what peacetime doctrine looked like after 500 years of practice. A senator that decade, during a routine budget hearing, called the Order the most dependable institution this government has ever had the good fortune to employ. He meant it as praise. Most Jedi who heard about it took it as exactly that. A Jedi Master named Innis Dalcor had spent the better part of 2 decades doing precisely that kind of work. He held no formal rank beyond his title, yet his name appeared on more trade agreements and border settlements that decade than almost any other Jedi serving the Senate. He was patient by nature, careful with his words, and unusually good at finding a version of any disagreement that let both sides walk away, believing they hadn't lost. Colleagues described him as steady. He preferred the word reliable, though he rarely bothered correcting anyone who used the other one instead. He had chosen this path early, back when he was still a younger knight, watching older warriors in the Order grow restless with nothing left to fight. Some of them treated peacetime almost like a punishment, drifting through assignments that no longer tested them the way old stories said the war once had. Dalcor never felt that restlessness himself. What he feared instead, quietly enough that he never admitted it out loud, was becoming exactly that kind of Jedi. Useful only in memory. Kept around out of respect rather than need. Mediation gave him a way to matter, in an era that no longer needed soldiers, and he built his entire career around making certain that fear never came true. On the morning this story finds him, Dalcor sat in a small mediation chamber, 3 levels below the main Senate floor, reviewing cargo manifests tied to a dispute between 2 mining operations fighting over a shared transport lane. The smaller of the 2, a modest outfit called the Halgrove Concern, had operated that route for nearly a generation. The larger one, a newer operation backed by a shipping combine most senators had only recently learned the name of, claimed a competing right to the same corridor based on a recently filed contract no one at Halgrove had seen coming. It was not glamorous work. It rarely was anymore. Cargo schedules, docking rights, and competing claims over transport fees filled most of Dalcor's days now, and he had long since made peace with the fact that this, not lightsaber duels or daring rescues, was simply what being a Jedi meant in an era with no wars left to fight. The 2 representatives arrived separately that morning, each bringing lawyers instead of soldiers, folders instead of weapons. Dalcor greeted both sides with identical courtesy, listened to nearly an hour of opening arguments, and began the slow, familiar work of finding language both parties could live with. The shipping combine's lawyer, he noticed, seemed unusually prepared, anticipating objections before Halgrove's representative had even finished raising them. Dalcor noted this briefly, the way he noted most small oddities in his line of work, then set the thought aside and returned to the documents in front of him. There was no shortage of well-prepared lawyers in the capital that decade. It hardly seemed worth dwelling on. By midday, a compromise had been reached over shared docking windows and adjusted transport fees. Hands were shaken. Documents were signed. No one raised their voice once during the entire process. This was, by every measure the Order used to judge itself, a complete success. It did not occur to Dalcor, nor to anyone else present, to ask who actually controlled the larger combine involved, or why its legal team had arrived with arguments tailored so precisely to Halgrove's specific weaknesses. There was no obvious reason to ask. Disputes like this happened constantly across the Republic, settled quietly, and forgotten within weeks. This one looked exactly like a dozen others Dalcor had already closed that year. Centuries earlier, this kind of quiet financial maneuvering would have meant little to anyone holding real power. War had been the currency that mattered then. Territory, soldiers, weapons capable of ending entire campaigns in a single afternoon. 500 years of uninterrupted peace had shifted what power actually looked like. Slowly enough that almost no one noticed the change happening in real time. Influence now lived in contracts, shipping rights, and the patient accumulation of debt owed by smaller operations to larger ones. None of it announced itself the way an army did. All of it added up just the same. Far from the Senate chamber, in a converted storage unit above a freight terminal, on a world few travelers bothered visiting twice, a different kind of lesson was taking place that same week. The master teaching it was old by then, his body slower than it had been decades earlier, though his patience had only sharpened with age. His apprentice sat across from him, listening to instructions passed down, almost word for word, through every pair that came before them both. The old stories you've heard about our kind, the master said, all involve armies, fortresses, lightning thrown across open battlefields. None of that matters now, and most of it never mattered as much as people believed it did. Even back then, the apprentice asked what mattered instead. Patience, the master answered, and debt. An army can be seen coming from 100 systems away. A loan cannot. A contract cannot. The galaxy spent 5 centuries learning to stop watching for soldiers. It never learned to watch for accountants, because accountants have never once frightened anyone. He gave a specific example, the way he always did, when a lesson risked sounding too abstract to hold. A mining world on the outer rim, he explained, had borrowed heavily from a trading consortium 2 decades earlier to fund new equipment after a poor harvest season. The loan had seemed reasonable at the time, the terms generous enough that local officials barely read past the first page before signing. Interest accumulated quietly in the years that followed. By the time anyone on that world noticed how deep the debt had grown, the consortium holding it already controlled enough of the planet's shipping rights to dictate prices on nearly everything the world exported. No invasion had taken place. No army had landed. The planet's independence had simply been negotiated away, one reasonable-sounding clause at a time, by people its own leaders had trusted enough not to read closely. That, the master said, is what power looks like now. It doesn't conquer. It refinances, the apprentice asked, as every apprentice eventually did. Why the rules still held at 2? Why not build something larger now, with the galaxy this distracted and this easy to move through unnoticed? The master considered the question longer than usual before answering. Because distraction isn't blindness, he said. It only looks that way from where you're sitting. The moment we grow large enough to be counted, someone eventually counts us. 2 can vanish into a crowd forever. 20 cannot. The first to walk this path understood that arithmetic, before either of us was born, and nothing about the last 5 centuries has proven him wrong. The apprentice spent the following weeks practicing exactly this kind of patience, learning to shape small disputes between minor shipping companies, without ever revealing a hand in any of it. Nothing about the work looked dramatic. A delayed shipment here, a quietly renegotiated contract there, small enough that no single action drew attention, consistent enough that, added together over years, real leverage began accumulating, in places no official record would ever trace back to a single cause. This was, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of dispute Dalcor had settled that same week, without giving it a second thought. Neither side knew the other existed. That, too, was the design, working precisely as intended. The old master died a few years later, passing quietly in the same converted storage unit where so many lessons had taken place across his lifetime. His apprentice buried what needed burying, destroyed what needed destroying, and inherited the only title that had ever truly mattered in their tradition. There was no ceremony. There never was. A new master simply existed where an old one used to, continuing a line the rest of the galaxy still firmly believed had ended 5 centuries earlier. On a forest moon, most citizens couldn't have located on a star chart anymore. In the temple's lower archives that same season, a young research assistant worked through old records ahead of an anniversary display planned to mark 700 years since the war's end. Administration had pushed the date forward by a few years, deciding a rounder number, made for a cleaner unveiling. The work was tedious mostly. Casualty lists, formal battle reports, language nobody used in conversation anymore. One detail held her attention longer than the rest. A final muster roll listed a single name without any confirmed status beside it. The space normally reserved for deceased or accounted for left simply blank. She brought it to her supervisor, expecting some explanation she hadn't thought of. He gave her one easily enough. Records from before standardized reporting were often incomplete, he told her, especially from a battle as chaotic as that one had been. The blank space was filled in for the display with a single word, presumed, which satisfied the paperwork even though it answered nothing at all. The display opened on schedule. Visitors walking past it that season read names carved into a long wall, meant to honor everyone who died ending the war for good. Most moved past quickly, glancing rather than reading closely, the way people usually treat displays about events they already feel certain they understand. No one stopped long enough to wonder what that single word, presumed, was actually covering for. Within a few years of inheriting the title, the new master took a step bolder than anything the lessons of the previous decade had prepared the old apprentice to expect from themselves. What drove that boldness wasn't ambition alone. It was fear of a different kind, never spoken to anyone, because there was no one left to speak it to, of becoming the one pair in a 1,000-year line who let the tradition slip, backward instead of forward. Every master before had left the work stronger than they found it. Failing to do the same felt, to this new master, like a kind of betrayal worse than discovery. Several competing shipping guilds, each modest in size, had spent years undercutting one another over the same handful of profitable trade lanes, weakening all of them in the process. The new master, working through intermediaries who never learned who they truly answered to, quietly encouraged the largest of these guilds toward a merger that on paper looked like simple business sense: reduced competition, shared shipping costs, better terms for everyone involved, the proposal claimed. And on the surface, that claim wasn't even false. What the smaller guilds didn't see was how thoroughly the terms of that merger had been shaped before they ever reached the negotiating table, written by lawyers who took instruction from interests none of them could name. By the time the ink dried, a single combined trading body controlled more shipping capacity across that sector than any one guild had managed on its own in a century. It was not, by any official measure, illegal. It was simply business, conducted the way business was conducted everywhere that decade. No senator objected. No Jedi mediator was even called in to review it, since nothing about the merger had technically required one. A decade later, the same master pushed one step further, helping that combined trading body justify its own private security force. Armed guards at first, hired to protect cargo from raiders along less traveled routes, a request the Senate approved without much debate, since piracy genuinely had become a minor nuisance that season. No one in that hearing room imagined those guards as anything more than what the paperwork claimed them to be. Fewer still considered what a private army, however small and however reasonably justified, might eventually grow into once the same patient hand kept shaping its growth for another century. This was how the largest trading combines of that era first began taking the shape future generations would eventually recognize, without needing the history explained to them, not through conquest, through paperwork that nobody thought worth questioning closely. Decades into wielding power this way, the new master began doing what every master before had eventually done: watching for someone worth replacing themselves with, since the rule that had kept this tradition alive for 5 centuries demanded succession as surely as it demanded secrecy. Candidates were considered quietly, tested in small, deniable ways that revealed character without revealing purpose. Most failed without ever realizing they had been tested at all. One, eventually, did not. That apprentice's training would stretch across decades still ahead, shaping someone who wouldn't step fully into the role until the galaxy had changed considerably from the one this chapter describes, until trade disputes had grown into something closer to trade wars, and boardroom influence had grown confident enough to test itself against the Republic, directly for the first time in 500 years. Dalcor continued his own work for many more years after that as well, settling dispute after dispute with the same steady patience that had defined his entire career. In his final year before retirement, he handled one last dispute involving the same combine he had helped settle that very first case with years earlier, now grown considerably larger than it had been. The terms it proposed this time were more aggressive, the smaller party on the other side noticeably less able to push back. Dalcor settled the matter the way he always did, finding language acceptable enough to both sides, though privately, he noted how much more leverage that combine now carried, compared to the modest outfit he remembered representing a similar position decades before. He mentioned this once, briefly, to a colleague over a shared meal, wondering aloud how a single shipping company had grown so large so quietly. His colleague shrugged and said companies did that sometimes, especially in good years. The conversation moved on to other matters within a minute, and Dalcor never raised the question again. He retired not long after, respected by colleagues, remembered fondly by the students he had trained, entirely unaware that several of the contracts he had helped finalize across his career carried fingerprints belonging to an organization the Republic considered extinct. Some months before he retired, a young Padawan asked him whether he ever missed the old stories about Jedi fighting in the war that supposedly ended every real danger in the galaxy for good. Dalcor considered the question carefully before answering, the way he considered most things. Those stories matter, he told her. They remind us what the alternative looks like. But I don't miss them. A negotiation that ends in a signed contract is worth more than a battle that ends in a monument. Fewer names get carved into stone that way. The Padawan accepted this answer the way most young Jedi of that era accepted similar answers from their teachers. It sounded wise. It matched everything else she had already been taught about the value of peace over conflict. Neither she nor Dalcor considered, even briefly, that peace itself might one day need defending in ways neither of them had ever been trained to recognize. That blind spot wasn't unique to either of them. It belonged to the entire era. Across 500 years, the galaxy's fears had reshaped themselves slowly enough that almost no citizen alive could point to the exact moment the shift happened. Fear of invasion had faded into fear of recession. Fear of armed conflict had faded into fear of failed negotiations costing jobs back home. These were smaller fears, easier to live alongside, and in most years, they were also the only fears that seemed to matter. What people hoped for had narrowed too. Fewer dreamed of victory anymore, and far more simply hoped next year's tariffs stayed manageable. Something else had quietly faded across those same 5 centuries, though almost no one would have named it directly if asked. Citizens had mostly given up expecting their representatives to explain exactly how trade agreements worked, trusting instead that someone qualified was handling the details on their behalf, and almost no one, anywhere in the Republic that era, still asked a question earlier generations had once considered obvious enough to raise without thinking twice. Who, exactly, benefited most from a peace this comfortable? The question hadn't been answered. It had simply stopped being asked. The way questions do, once enough years pass without anyone needing the answer urgently. The Jedi Council of that era reviewed the Order's standing with the Senate once a year, as tradition required, and the report delivered that particular season praised the growing partnership between the Temple and the galaxy's largest trading houses without a single note of caution attached to it. Faster resolutions, fewer disputes escalating into anything serious, a republic running smoother, by every visible measure, than it had in living memory. One master on the council did ask, almost as an afterthought near the end of the session, whether anyone had reviewed how much shipping capacity now sat under the control of so few combined trading bodies. The question was acknowledged, noted for a future agenda that never quite arrived, and the session moved on to other business. No one present meant any harm by setting it aside. There simply wasn't, by anyone's honest accounting that day, a visible reason for alarm. By the time Dalcor's successor took over his old division, the trading houses and banking clans that had grown quietly across these centuries of comfort had become large enough to negotiate directly with Senate committees as something close to equals. Lobbyists representing these clans now kept standing offices within walking distance of the chamber itself, their names familiar to every aide who worked there. No one in government found this particularly alarming. It had happened slowly, reasonably, one contract at a time, the same way most dangerous things happen when nobody is watching closely enough to notice the pattern forming underneath them. Somewhere ahead of where this chapter ends, that comfort would be tested for the first time in 5 centuries. Not by a war fought over old ideas, but by a war fought over shipping lanes and tariffs, started by the very kind of trading interests this era had spent 500 years learning not to question. No one living through these settled, quiet decades could have predicted that. Most of them weren't looking for it. They had, after all, finally stopped looking for very much at all. A war, after all, announces itself. A balance sheet does not. The war that came was not the kind anyone in the capital had been trained to expect anymore. It began over a trade route, the way the master in the storage unit had once predicted it eventually would. A coalition of commerce guilds, frustrated for years by tariffs they considered unfair and shipping lanes they felt should belong to whoever could pay for them, finally stopped negotiating and started fighting instead. Their fleets were not large by the standards of the old war centuries earlier, but the Republic's defenses had shrunk even further across 500 years of peace. Standing armies had been replaced with trade inspectors. Warships had been mothballed or sold for scrap. When armed freighters and droid-crewed fighters began seizing supply convoys along the Republic's busiest corridors, there was almost nothing ready to stop them. The first convoy taken belonged to a medical shipping line carrying supplies bound for 3 outer systems recovering from a poor growing season. Its crew surrendered without a fight, since none of them had ever been trained to expect one, and the guild coalition holding it released a broadcast within hours showing the captured ships drifting silently outside a station no one in the capital had heard of before that week. The message was simple enough that it needed no translation. Routes the Republic had always assumed were its own, to govern now belonged to whoever could hold them by force. Panic spread through the Senate faster than any single battle did. Worlds dependent on those convoys for food and medicine began reporting shortages within weeks. Insurance markets that had never priced in the possibility of open conflict collapsed overnight. For the first time in 5 centuries, ordinary citizens across the core worlds found themselves afraid of something that wasn't an abstract historical idea. Among the Jedi sent to address the crisis was a young knight named Dooku, sharp-tongued and aristocratic by birth, already known within the Order for an impatience with bureaucracy that some masters found refreshing and others found troubling. Born into one of the wealthier noble houses still recognized on his homeworld, he had given up an inheritance most people in the galaxy could only imagine to join an order he believed stood for something greater than comfort. That conviction had only sharpened across his training. He had spent his early career frustrated by exactly the kind of slow, careful mediation work that defined the era: the Halgrove disputes, the tariff hearings, the endless committee language that took weeks to settle what he believed could be resolved in an afternoon with enough resolve behind it. The crisis, as terrible as it was for everyone living through it, gave him something he had quietly wanted for years. A problem that couldn't be solved with paperwork alone. He was paired, as junior Jedi often were during that crisis, with one of the Order's oldest living masters, Yoda, small in stature, slow to speak, and almost unnervingly patient even in the middle of a war. Yoda had trained generations of Jedi by then, and carried a kind of calm that steadied everyone serving alongside him. a steadiness Dooku had come to respect deeply during his own years as a student, even when he found it difficult to match. Where Dooku wanted to move fast, Yoda insisted on moving carefully. Not slowly, he clarified more than once, but carefully, since the two were not the same thing at all. Together, they coordinated what remained of the Republic's scattered defense fleet, supplementing it with volunteer pilots, requisitioned freighters refitted in a hurry, and a corps of Jedi willing to fly directly into combat for the first time in living memory. Dooku argued for striking the Guild Coalition's central command directly, ending the war in one decisive blow rather than grinding through smaller engagements for months. Yoda agreed, though not for the reasons Dooku expected. Not because speed wins wars, he told him the night before the operation began, because this war was never about territory. It is about confidence, theirs and ours. Whoever proves they can still act decisively wins this, whether or not a single extra system changes hands. The strike came 3 days later, aimed at the coalition's primary staging point near a junction of 3 major trade lanes. Dooku led the assault personally, cutting through defensive screens with a precision that surprised even the masters who had trained him. His blade work that day was later described by pilots who flew alongside him as something closer to a performance than a battle, each motion economical, nothing wasted. Droid fighters falling away from him in numbers that made even seasoned soldiers pause to watch before remembering they had their own targets to manage. He boarded the staging platform itself before the fighting in open space had fully ended, moving through corridors lit only by emergency lighting, cutting down resistance that grew thinner the closer he came to the command deck. Yoda, meanwhile, worked the diplomatic side of the same operation simultaneously, reaching out through back channels to commanders within the coalition who had begun losing confidence in their own leadership once Republic forces proved willing to fight rather than simply negotiate. He spoke with 3 separate commanders over the course of that single night, never raising his voice, never threatening anything beyond the plain truth of what was already happening in the system above them. By the time Dooku reached the command deck, 2 of those 3 commanders had already begun quietly withdrawing their forces from the surrounding sectors. The combination worked faster than almost anyone expected. Within a week of the staging point's fall, coalition leadership sued for terms. Within a month, a formal treaty had been signed, ending a war that many in the Senate had quietly feared might drag on for years. The celebrations that followed were larger than anything the Capitol had seen in living memory. Crowds filled the plazas outside the Senate building for 3 straight nights. Dooku's name appeared in news broadcasts across a dozen systems, praised as proof that the Order hadn't lost its edge despite 5 centuries spent mostly negotiating instead of fighting. Yoda received quieter praise, the kind reserved for those who preferred it that way, though those who worked closely with him understood exactly how much of the victory depended on his patience rather than anyone's blade. In one of the outer systems that had gone weeks without proper medical shipments, a clinic administrator who had spent that month rationing supplies down to single doses watched the news of the treaty's signing on a cracked, terminal screen in her supply room. She had buried 2 patients that week whose conditions might have ended differently with proper medication. She didn't cheer the way crowds in the Capitol were cheering. She simply sat down for a long moment, allowing herself to believe, cautiously, that shipments would resume soon, and that whatever had nearly broken her system's supply chain had been handled by people who understood the stakes better than she'd feared they did. In the relief that followed, the Senate moved quickly to make sure nothing like the crisis could happen again. New trade laws were drafted within weeks, designed to prevent any single coalition of commerce guilds from amassing the kind of independent military capacity that had nearly crippled half the Republic's supply lines. Tariff structures were rewritten. Licensing requirements for armed cargo escorts were tightened considerably. One senator, presenting the framework to a packed chamber, called it the most important piece of trade legislation this body has passed in 2 centuries, and asked for an expedited vote before public attention drifted elsewhere, as it always eventually did. Few representatives objected to the pace. Most had spent the last month fielding furious messages from constituents demanding exactly this kind of decisive response, and few wanted to be the senator remembered as the one who slowed it down. The vote passed within a day of being called, with margins wide enough that the result was barely worth reporting as news. For the first time in generations, the Senate moved with real urgency, eager to convert a frightening crisis into a lasting structural fix before public attention drifted elsewhere. Urgency, though, rarely produces careful work. The reforms were drafted by committees racing against a closing window of political will, reviewed by aides exhausted from weeks of crisis sessions, and passed with margins so wide that almost no one bothered reading every clause closely before voting. Most of the language held up exactly as intended. Some of it did not. Far from the celebrations, a master and apprentice who had spent 3 generations learning to read documents like these, more carefully than anyone else in the galaxy noticed, something the Senate's own drafters had missed entirely. Buried within the new licensing framework was a clause meant to let smaller, independently chartered trading houses register private security forces without the lengthy review process now required of larger guilds. Reasonable exception on paper, designed to protect small operators from the same kind of guild consolidation that had caused the crisis in the first place. What the drafters hadn't considered was how easily a large interest could simply charter dozens of smaller shell companies, each one technically independent, each one qualifying for the lighter review process on its own. The apprentice, now well into their own training under the latest master in the line, brought the clause to their teacher's attention within days of the law's passage. They built a door, the apprentice said, and labeled it small enough that no one thought to guard it. The master studied the language for a long moment before answering. Every reform written in a hurry has one of these somewhere. Fear makes lawmakers thorough about the danger they just survived, and careless about every danger they haven't imagined yet. Remember that. It will still be true centuries from now. And if someone notices the pattern eventually, the apprentice asked, traces enough of these doors back to the same hand holding them open, then we will have already moved through them, the master said, long before anyone thinks to count how many doors we used. Within a year, a network of smaller chartered trading entities, each independently registered and individually unremarkable, began operating under the protection of the new licensing framework. No single one of them controlled enough capacity to draw scrutiny. Each filed its paperwork correctly, paid its modest fees on schedule, and operated within every letter of the new law, exactly as written. Together, coordinated quietly through channels that left no paper trail connecting them. They controlled considerably more security capability than the law's authors had ever intended to permit. A Senate auditor, reviewing licensing applications 2 years later, noted, in a routine report that almost no one above his pay grade ever read, that the number of small independent security charters had tripled since the reform's passage. He attributed this to the law working as intended, encouraging healthy competition among smaller operators. No one corrected him, because no one studying the numbers closely enough to correct him existed within the Senate's own offices that year. Dooku knew nothing of any of this. He returned from the crisis more certain than ever that decisive action, properly applied, could solve problems generations of cautious diplomacy had allowed to fester. He was promoted soon after, his reputation cemented as one of the most capable Jedi of his generation. His name spoken alongside the great commanders of the old war centuries earlier. In quieter moments, away from the celebrations and the praise, He found himself increasingly frustrated by how rarely the Senate showed that same decisiveness once the immediate danger had passed. Within a year, the same body that had voted unanimously to reform trade law now argued for weeks over a routine agricultural subsidy, as though the urgency of the crisis had simply evaporated the moment it stopped being convenient to feel. He didn't yet know what to do with that frustration. For now, it stayed a private irritation, nothing more, voiced occasionally to fellow knights over quiet meals, and rarely taken further than that. Yoda returned to his usual duties as well, training new students, mediating new disputes, watching the galaxy settle back into its familiar comfort within months of a crisis that had briefly threatened to end it. He sensed something during those months he couldn't quite name, a faint unease beneath the celebrations, the same background hum a handful of older Jedi had noticed for years without ever finding words for it. He mentioned it once to a fellow master, who suggested it was simply the lingering tension of the war finally working its way out of his system. He accepted the explanation, mostly, and let the feeling fade along with everything else that season, though it never fully left him the way explanations usually manage to make feelings disappear. Across the Republic, citizens returned to their routines with a confidence that felt, to most of them, fully earned. The Jedi had proven themselves again. The Senate had acted decisively for once. The danger that had briefly threatened everyone's comfort had been met, defeated, and converted into stronger laws meant to prevent its return. No one celebrating that victory understood they were also celebrating the exact moment certain interests learned, with perfect clarity, precisely how much room a frightened government leaves unguarded when it moves quickly enough to feel safe again. History books written in the years that followed remembered the Stark Crisis, as it came to be called, as proof that the Republic could still defend itself when truly tested. Children studied Dooku's name alongside accounts of his decisive strike, and Yoda's quieter diplomacy earned its own respectful paragraph in every standard curriculum. The trade reforms that followed were held up for decades afterward as a model of swift, responsible governance, cited approvingly whenever some future crisis demanded a similarly urgent legislative response. Almost none of those later citations paused to examine how thoroughly that urgency had been exploited within the first year of the law's existence, since by then the exploitation had already woven itself so deeply into ordinary commerce that it no longer looked like exploitation at all. It simply looked like business, the same way it always eventually did. It would be a long time before anyone thought to ask what, exactly, had been breathing in that exhale alongside them. The hand that moved through those doors for the next several decades belonged to a Bith scholar most of the Republic's financial world knew only by reputation, never by face. He operated under names that changed with each new venture, building fortunes through banking houses on a dozen worlds before quietly transferring control to successors who never realized whose instructions they had truly been following. He preferred working through proxies entirely, conducting his actual business from private chambers most of his own associates never saw, communicating through coded transmissions that auditors several decades later would still find impossible to fully trace back to a single source. Within his own tradition, away from any of those names, he was simply Darth Tenebrous, the latest in a line stretching back nearly 1,000 years to a forest moon almost no one still living could place on a chart. Tenebrous took his own apprentice late in life, later than most masters in the line had managed. Choosing carefully from a small handful of candidates he had quietly tested across 2 decades of searching. The one he finally chose was a moon banker's son, born into a culture that already understood debt, leverage, and patience better than almost any other species in the galaxy. The boy showed an unusual gift even by the standards Tenebrous expected, Numbers seemed to organize themselves naturally around him, revealing patterns in markets and treaties that took other analysts years of study to even partially understand. Tenebris trained him the way every master before had trained their own apprentice, blending the old lessons about armies and hiding with newer ones about currency, biology, and the slow accumulation of leverage across systems too distracted to notice it building. The apprentice absorbed all of it quickly, perhaps too quickly. Within a decade, he had already begun quietly outperforming his teacher in the one area that mattered most to their tradition, seeing further ahead than anyone else in the room, including the man training him to see that far in the first place. "You study the markets the way a starving man studies a locked pantry," Tenebris told him once, not entirely as a compliment. "Because somewhere behind every locked door," the apprentice answered, "there is always something worth counting." Tenebris found the response unsettling enough to mention it to no one. Since there was no one left in his life to mention anything to, he began. In the years that followed, watching his apprentice with the same careful attention every master in the line was supposed to maintain, not out of cruelty, but out of the same arithmetic Tenebris himself had once been taught. A master who stopped watching his apprentice closely enough to notice ambition sharpening into hunger was a master who had already lost, whether or not he understood it yet. He tested the apprentice repeatedly during those final years, the way every master before him had tested their own students, watching to see whether ambition would express itself as patience or as impatience. Once given enough room to grow, the apprentice passed every test Tenebris set for him, sometimes too easily, demonstrating restraint so flawless that Tenebris occasionally wondered, in the privacy of his own thoughts, whether he was witnessing genuine discipline or simply a more sophisticated kind of performance than he had ever encountered before. He never settled that question to his own satisfaction. He ran out of time before he could. He was right to watch. He simply didn't watch carefully enough. The poison that ended Tenebris's life worked slowly, mixed into a tea he had shared with his apprentice for years without incident, adjusted in small enough doses across several months that no single dose ever drew suspicion. Tenebris had grown careless in exactly the way comfort always made people careless, trusting a ritual repeated so many times it no longer registered as a risk worth examining. By the time his body finally failed him, in a private study, far from anyone who might have asked questions, Tenebris understood exactly what was happening to him, and exactly who had done it. He said nothing about it. There was nothing to say that the rule itself hadn't already explained 1,000 years earlier. A master always slightly afraid of being replaced. An apprentice always slightly hungry to replace him. The tension wasn't a flaw in the design. It had always been the entire design, and Tenebris had simply lost the version of it that mattered most to him personally. His apprentice buried what needed burying, the same way every apprentice before him had, and inherited a title that came with no ceremony beyond the simple fact of surviving the only test that had ever truly counted. From that point forward, within the small handful of records anyone would ever bother keeping, he was known as Darth Plagueis. Plagueis expanded what Tenebris had built far beyond anything his own master had ever attempted. Where Tenebris worked through individual banking houses, Plagueis began quietly consolidating influence across dozens of them simultaneously, building towards something closer to a single coordinated financial network disguised as ordinary competition. He took formal, public positions within several of the Republic's largest financial institutions, hiding in plain sight the way the oldest teachings had always recommended. His true nature concealed behind a reputation as simply the most brilliant economist of his generation. He was patient in ways that went beyond even what his tradition normally demanded. Decades meant little to him personally, since whatever extended his own life beyond the ordinary limits of his species remained a secret he shared with no one. not even the apprentice he would eventually choose. Colleagues who worked alongside him across 30 or 40 years quietly remarked, when they thought no one important was listening, that he seemed to age more slowly than any of them, attributing it to good fortune or careful living rather than anything they would ever think to question further. He spent those decades reading the galaxy's slow drift toward greater dependence on trade guilds and banking clans, recognizing in that drift an opportunity no master before him had ever possessed the patience or the lifespan to fully exploit. What he needed, he eventually decided, was not simply another apprentice trained to manage markets quietly from the shadows. He needed one capable of stepping into the light itself, into the Republic's own government, close enough to its center of power to shape decisions directly rather than merely profiting from their consequences afterward. He found what he was looking for on a small, agriculturally prosperous world called Naboo. The boy he sensed there, still young, came from a family of modest political standing and considerable personal ambition, the kind of household where dinner conversations regularly turned toward questions of influence and advancement, long before the boy was old enough to fully understand them. His father held a respectable but unremarkable seat on a regional council, the sort of position that opened doors without ever fully walking through any of them. And the boy grew up watching that gap between respectability and real power, with an attentiveness his siblings never seemed to share. Naboo itself, peaceful and prosperous in the way most core-adjacent worlds had grown across these settled centuries, gave him little to push against directly. What it gave him instead was time, and an unusually clear view of how thoroughly comfort could dull the ambitions of everyone around him, while leaving his own untouched. Plagueis felt something in him from a distance. Long before any formal meeting took place, a hunger remarkably similar to his own, paired with a natural gift for reading people that no amount of training could have fully manufactured on its own. He approached carefully, the way every step of his tradition demanded. Years passed before the boy understood he was being shaped at all. Mentored at first through intermediaries who presented themselves as patrons interested in a promising young mind, then later through Plagueis himself, appearing as a wealthy and unusually well-connected benefactor, with an interest in the boy's education and eventual career. "You see further than the people around you," Plagueis told him during one of their early private conversations, choosing his words the way a man chooses tools for a very specific job. That is not a gift most people are given. It is also not one most people know what to do with. The boy, sharp enough even then to recognize when he was being evaluated, rather than simply complimented, asked what someone was supposed to do with it instead. "Build patience around it," Plagueis answered. "Talent without patience burns brightly and dies young. Talent with patience outlives everyone who ever doubted it." Over the years that followed, Plagueis guided the boy's education with the same careful attention he applied to every long-term investment, steering him toward political studies, toward mentors within Naboo's government who could open doors a teenager from a modestly influential family wouldn't normally have access to, toward an understanding of how power within the Republic actually moved beneath its formal, polite surface. He taught him to read a room before he ever spoke in one, to identify which senators voted out of genuine conviction and which voted out of debts owed to people they would never publicly name. He taught him patience the same way Tenebris had once taught it to him, though he adjusted the lessons to suit a student who would need to wear that patience publicly, smiling through committee meetings and campaign dinners rather than hiding in storage units and converted freight depots the way every master before him had been forced to. None of it looked unusual to anyone watching from outside. Wealthy patrons sponsoring promising young political talent was common enough across the core worlds that no one thought to ask deeper questions about this particular arrangement. The boy's own family was, if anything, grateful for the attention, assuming their son had simply caught the eye of an unusually generous benefactor who recognized talent when he saw it. In a sense, that assumption wasn't even wrong. It simply left out everything that mattered most about why that talent had been recognized in the first place. By the time the boy was old enough to be formally accepted as Plagueis's apprentice, in every sense their tradition recognized, he had already absorbed enough of the old teachings to understand exactly what he was inheriting, not merely a fortune, and not merely a body of dangerous knowledge, but 1,000 years of patient arithmetic, refined generation after generation, by masters who had learned, sometimes through their own deaths, exactly how far comfort could be stretched before anyone thought to question it. Plagueis gave him a new name to mark the change. The same way Tenebrous once had, the same way the very first master had given one to his own apprentice on a cold afternoon 9 centuries earlier. From that point forward, in the only circles that would ever know the truth of it, he was Darth Sidious. Their partnership began exactly the way their tradition always insisted it should, in complete secrecy. Far from the political career Sidious was already beginning to build openly on Naboo, far from any record that could ever connect a rising young political talent to a centuries-old conspiracy the Republic still firmly believed had ended on a forest moon almost no one could locate on a star chart. What made this pairing different from everyone that came before it was not the sown depth of their ambition, since every pair in the line had carried ambition enough to fuel a war if pointed in that direction. It was the precision of their timing. Plagueis hadn't simply trained an apprentice capable of hiding within the galaxy's financial systems the way every master before him had managed. He had built one capable of eventually standing at the exact center of the Republic's government, with full legal legitimacy, while the rest of his tradition continued operating exactly as it always had, patient, hidden, and utterly invisible to a galaxy that had spent 1,000 years training itself not to look in his direction. There were nights, in the early years of that apprenticeship, when even Plagueis allowed himself to wonder how far this particular pairing might eventually reach. He had outlived 2 masters of his own, in a manner of speaking, and had built influence across more systems than any single pair in the tradition's history. Even so, he kept his ambitions bounded by the same arithmetic the first master had taught 9 centuries earlier. 2, never more than 2. Patience, never haste. Whatever this apprentice might eventually become, Plagueis intended to remain the one shaping that becoming, for as long as his own unnaturally extended life allowed him to. The wound that had once been an army was, by the time their work together truly began, no longer even pretending to be a battlefield. It lived in trade contracts and campaign donations, in patient decades of careful relationships, built across institutions, too comfortable to ask who exactly stood to benefit most from the peace they kept congratulating themselves for maintaining. It would be many more years before that wound finally stepped fully into the light. By the time it did, almost no one left in the galaxy would remember it had ever worn any other shape at all. Nothing about the next 2.5 decades would ever earn its own chapter in a standard history text. That was, in its own way, the entire point of them. Palpatine entered the Senate young for his role, elected to represent Naboo, after a campaign built almost entirely on competence rather than charisma. His opponent, an older and far more established political figure, ran on decades of visible accomplishment and a long record of public service that should have made the race a formality. Palpatine ran instead on a simple, repeated promise: steady administration, careful budgeting, and a quiet, reliable voice for a world that had never demanded much more than that from its representatives. He visited every district personally, listened more than he spoke, and won by a margin that surprised even his own modest campaign staff. Voters found him easy to trust, precisely because he gave them so little to be excited about. He answered questions directly. He kept his promises modest enough to actually keep. Within his first year in office, colleagues already described him, using words like dependable and sensible, the same words an earlier generation had once used for a different kind of Jedi entirely. He learned the rhythms of the chamber quickly. The way someone learns a language, they were always somehow fluent in, without ever studying it formally. Committee assignments that bored most junior senators, agricultural subsidies, shipping regulation amendments, minor border adjustments between systems no one outside those systems had ever heard of, became, in his hands, opportunities to build relationships with colleagues who would barely remember meeting him a decade later, even as those same colleagues found themselves voting his way on issues that actually mattered to him. His approach to influence was patient, almost to the point of invisibility. He rarely pushed hard for anything. He offered favors before anyone needed to ask for them, small ones at first, the kind that cost him little and meant a great deal to whoever received them. A scheduling change here, a quiet word to smooth over a procedural dispute there. He remembered names, birthdays, the small personal details most senators forgot the moment a conversation ended. A junior aide who once mentioned, in passing, a sick parent back home found a handwritten note of concern waiting on her desk the following week, along with information about a specialist Palpatine happened to know on her parents' homeworld. None of it looked like strategy to anyone watching. It looked like decency, which was, in its own way, exactly the point. A trade dispute that crossed his desk in his third year in office offered an early glimpse of how thoroughly he had already absorbed his private education. Two neighboring systems were arguing over fishing rights along a shared maritime border, a dispute small enough that most senior senators delegated it to staff without a second thought. Palpatine handled it personally instead, spending weeks reviewing details no one expected him to bother with. Traveling once to meet representatives from both systems in person, rather than simply exchanging formal correspondence. Eventually he proposed a compromise so evenly balanced that both systems credited him publicly with saving them years of costly arbitration. One delegate, an older fisheries administrator who had expected nothing more than a junior aide's polite indifference, later told colleagues she had never met a senator who actually seemed to care about a dispute this small. The compromise also happened to route a modest but steady stream of shipping traffic through a transfer station quietly owned, several layers removed, by interests connected to his private mentor. No one investigating the matter, and almost no one ever did, would have found anything resembling the wrongdoing. Every clause held up exactly as written. This was how most of his early career unfolded. Small, defensible, individually meaningless decisions, each one nudging some distant outcome, a fraction of a degree, in a direction only he and one other person in the entire galaxy could have explained. A senior senator from a neighboring system, a woman named Menachi Tor, became something close to a mentor to him during these early years, taking the quiet young senator from Naboo under her wing, the way established politicians sometimes did with promising newcomers. She introduced him to committee chairs who might otherwise have overlooked him, vouched for his judgment in rooms he hadn't yet earned access to on his own merit, and never once suspected that the gratitude he expressed so consistently was anything other than genuine. In a sense, it was genuine. He was, after all, simply grateful that her sponsorship made his own much longer plan considerably easier to execute. The Chancellor presiding over the Republic during most of these years was a man named Finis Valorum, inheriting an office that demanded equal parts patience and stamina, neither of which the Republic's bureaucracy ever seemed to run short of requiring. He came from a respected political family with a long history of Republic service, raised from childhood with an almost reverent belief in the institutions he would one day help govern. That belief never fully left him. Even on the difficult days, when the chamber's endless procedural delays tested it severely. Valorum governed the way most chancellors of his era governed, through committee, through consensus, through a deep and largely justified faith that the institutions surrounding him were fundamentally sound, even when individual outcomes occasionally disappointed him. He was not a careless leader. He read reports thoroughly, often staying in his office well past the hours his staff considered reasonable, working through budget summaries and trade filings. Most of his predecessors would have delegated without a second glance. He listened to advisors from across the political spectrum, genuinely weighing arguments rather than simply performing the appearance of weighing them. What Valorum lacked wasn't diligence. It was the particular kind of suspicion that might have let him notice a single senator's quiet, steady accumulation of favors as anything other than ordinary political competence. The republic he had inherited simply didn't train its leaders to look for that kind of danger anymore. 5 centuries of peace had taught an entire governing class to watch for incompetence, corruption that announced itself, scandals loud enough to make headlines. It had never taught them to watch for patience. Valorum and Palpatine crossed paths regularly during those years, as senators and chancellors inevitably did, exchanging the polite, professional warmth that defined most relationships within the chamber. Valorum genuinely liked him. Palpatine was, by every measure Valorum used to judge his colleagues, exactly the kind of senator the Republic needed more of. Competent, modest, untouched by the petty scandals that occasionally embarrassed louder, more ambitious members of the body. You could ask for more. Valorum told him once, during a private dinner, meant to discuss an unrelated trade matter, and people would likely give it to you. You've earned enough goodwill in this chamber for a more prominent role. Palpatine smiled in the particular way he had practiced for exactly such moments, modest and faintly amused at his own perceived limitations. I'm not certain prominence suits me, Chancellor. I find I accomplish more when people aren't watching closely enough to feel threatened by what I'm doing. Valorum laughed at that, taking it as the kind of self-deprecating humor common among the Republic's more effective administrators. He repeated the line approvingly to colleagues more than once over the following months, never once recognizing it as anything other than a joke. Across the Senate floor during these same years, the slow consolidation that had been building for centuries continued largely unremarked. Trade guilds merged with other trade guilds. Banking clans absorbed smaller competitors through transactions too technical for most senators to follow without specialized staff. Staff that increasingly came recommended by the very institutions whose growing influence those staff were meant to help the Senate monitor. Budget committees, stretched thin across thousands of routine matters each session, increasingly relied on outside experts to summarize complex filings rather than reviewing them directly. A junior committee director, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of filings crossing her desk each week, gratefully accepted a recommendation for an outside analyst from a respected trade association, never thinking to ask why that association seemed so eager to help her office manage its workload more efficiently. Few senators thought to ask who employed those experts before that decade, and fewer still thought to ask afterward. Valorum oversaw all of this the way a conscientious administrator oversees a system functioning, by every visible measure, exactly as it was designed to function. Disputes were resolved, trade flowed. Citizens across the core worlds enjoyed a standard of living that, by historical measures, had never been higher. If pressed, Valorum would have said the Republic was working precisely as its founders had intended. Imperfect in countless small ways, but fundamentally sound, fundamentally safe, fundamentally his to protect rather than to fear. Late at night, in private chambers far from the Senate floor, Palpatine continued meeting with his mentor on a schedule disguised within his already demanding political calendar. late dinners that ran longer than official records suggested, working retreats that left no detailed itinerary behind. Plagueis reviewed his apprentice's progress with the same patient scrutiny he applied to every long-term investment, occasionally adjusting strategy, occasionally simply listening, as Palpatine described, with evident satisfaction, exactly how thoroughly his colleagues had stopped paying attention to him. "They've started calling me reliable," Palpatine told him during one of these meetings, somewhere in his second decade in office. "Reliable is the most useful word in any language," Plagueis answered. "No one ever investigates reliable." "Sometimes I wonder if it troubles them at all," Palpatine said, "how little they actually know about the people they trust most." "It won't trouble them until it's far too late to matter," Plagueis said. "That has always been the arrangement. Comfort asks fewer questions than fear does. We have simply made certain, generation after generation, that comfort is the only thing this galaxy ever has reason to feel." Palpatine considered this for a long moment, turning a glass of wine slowly between his fingers in the dim light of the room. "And when comfort finally breaks," he asked, "what replaces it?" "Whatever we've already built to replace it with," Plagueis said, "which is precisely why we keep building." By the final years of this quiet stretch, small cracks had begun appearing in the Republic's confidence, though almost none of them looked serious enough on their own to draw sustained attention. A budget shortfall here, attributed to unusually generous subsidies passed years earlier. A trade dispute there, growing slightly sharper than similar disputes had grown in living memory. Reports of pirate activity along certain outer rim shipping lanes, blamed on opportunistic criminals rather than anything more organized. A handful of smaller worlds began quietly defaulting on debts owed to banking, clans that, decades earlier, had seemed only too happy to extend generous lines of credit. Valorum addressed each of these individually, competently, the way he addressed everything, never quite connecting them into a single pattern, because no single report ever presented them that way. No one in the Senate that decade was lying about the state of the Republic. Most of what they reported was, strictly speaking, true. What none of them had, what nothing in their training or their institutions had ever equipped them to develop, was the particular kind of attention required to notice that the same handful of interests kept appearing, quietly, at the edges of nearly every one of these small, individually explainable problems. The soil for what came next was being prepared during exactly these years, by people who had no idea they were preparing anything at all. Senators voting for routine appropriations, aides recommending outside experts, a chancellor extending trust to a colleague who had spent 2 decades earning every ounce of it through patience no one had ever been trained to fully question. A fisheries administrator, grateful for a fair compromise, who would later describe the senator from Naboo to anyone who asked as one of the most decent men she had ever worked with in government. Nothing about any single decision made during this stretch would have alarmed a single person reviewing it in isolation. That was, as it always had been within this particular tradition, the entire design working exactly as intended. Somewhere in the years just ahead, all of it would finally converge on a small, unremarkable trade dispute involving a peaceful agricultural world most senators that decade couldn't have located on a star chart without help. The trade dispute that finally tested the Republic's confidence began exactly where small disputes always began, the century, with a tariff disagreement no one expected to escalate. A coalition of commerce guilds, frustrated by new taxation routes imposed on outer shipping lanes, moved warships into orbit around a small, peaceful agricultural world and announced a blockade until their demands were met. The world was Naboo. Few in the capital that week imagined the dispute would last more than a month. The Senate, true to its centuries-old habits, responded with discussion rather than action. Committees were formed. Statements were issued condemning the blockade in careful, diplomatic language that committed the Republic to nothing beyond disapproval. Chancellor Valorum, under pressure from all sides, and constrained by procedures designed for an era with no real enemies left to oppose, did the only thing his office still allowed him to do quickly. He dispatched 2 Jedi to negotiate a resolution. One was a seasoned Jedi Master named Qui-Gon Jinn, known across the Order for an independent streak that occasionally put him at odds with the Council's more cautious instincts. The other was his Padawan, a young man named Obi-Wan Kenobi, talented and disciplined, in ways his master sometimes found almost too rigid, though he never said so unkindly. Together they boarded a Republic cruiser bound for Naboo, expecting the kind of routine negotiation that had defined Jedi diplomacy for 5 centuries. What greeted them instead was an ambush. The Trade Guild's representatives, rather than receiving the Jedi for talks, attempted to gas their quarters and kill them outright before any negotiation could even begin. Qui-Gon felt it coming a heartbeat before the attack started, a sharpness in the Force he hadn't felt in years, distinct from anything he associated with ordinary Guild cowardice. He and Obi-Wan escaped the ship and the planet's blockade together, fleeing toward the surface as Naboo itself came under full invasion, droid forces landing by the thousands across a world that hadn't seen organized warfare in living memory. On the surface, the 2 Jedi found a population utterly unprepared for what was happening to them. Naboo's modest defense forces, built for ceremony more than combat, fell back within hours. Its young queen, barely out of her teenage years, was captured along with much of her government before she managed a narrow escape with the Jedi's help, fleeing the planet entirely aboard a damaged transport bound for safety beyond the blockade. It was during the chaos of that escape, on a desert world far from Naboo, where the ship was forced down for repairs, that Qui-Gon first sensed something he hadn't expected to feel again in his lifetime. A presence in the Force unlike anything documented in any record he had studied, old, patient, and unmistakably trained in the same discipline the Jedi had spent 1,000 years believing extinct. He said as much to the Queen's advisors, and later, more formally, to the Jedi Council itself, once contact was re-established. He described the presence carefully, choosing his words the way a man chooses them when he expects to be doubted. Whatever had attacked them wasn't simply a guild's hired muscle, he insisted. It moved like something trained for centuries in a discipline meant to remain hidden. The council listened. Some members took the warning seriously enough to authorize closer investigation. Most, however, responded the way the Order had responded to similar warnings for 900 years, with polite acknowledgement, gentle reassurance, and a quiet unwillingness to fully credit the idea that an enemy believed exterminated for 1,000 years could simply reappear, fully formed, without anyone noticing the centuries of preparation behind it. The dark side has been quiet for a very long time, Qui-Gon, one senior master told him during a brief holographic exchange. Quiet does not mean gone, but it rarely means this either. Qui-Gon didn't argue further. There was little point. He had learned, across decades of service, exactly how far this particular kind of caution could be pushed before it simply became another wall to talk past rather than through. The presence he sensed had a name, though almost no one outside a tightly guarded circle would ever learn it during these events. He called himself Darth Maul, trained from childhood by a master patient, enough to wait decades for exactly this moment. The moment the Republic's oldest fear could finally step into the open, disguised as nothing more than hired enforcement, working for an unhappy trade coalition. Maul tracked the fleeing Queen's party relentlessly, intercepting them twice more before they finally reached Coruscant to plead their case before the Senate. Each encounter ended the same way. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan held him off, narrowly, neither side fully understanding the other's true nature, though Qui-Gon's certainty only deepened with every clash. This was no guild enforcer. This was something the galaxy had spent 5 centuries convincing itself no longer existed. The political crisis unfolded almost as violently as the military one, though with words instead of blades. The Queen, desperate and increasingly distrustful of a Senate too slow to help her, was advised by a quiet, sympathetic senator from her own world to call for a vote of no confidence against Chancellor Valorum himself, arguing that only new leadership could move decisively enough to save her people. That senator was Palpatine. He delivered the suggestion with evident reluctance, framing it as a painful necessity rather than anything he wanted for himself. And the Queen, trusting him completely after years of his quiet service to her world, agreed. The vote succeeded. Valorum, blindsided by a crisis his own institutions had never trained him to anticipate, stepped down within days, and the Senate moved immediately to select a successor capable of resolving the Naboo emergency before it spread further. Among the candidates nominated, one stood out as uniquely qualified. A senator with 2 decades of spotless service, deep sympathy for the besieged world at the center of the crisis, and not a single enemy in the chamber willing to publicly oppose him. While that vote unfolded in the capital, the Queen made a different decision entirely, returning to Naboo with the Jedi and a small invasion force assembled from her planet's native population to retake her world by force rather than wait any longer for the Senate's help. The final battle that followed unfolded across several fronts at once, a desperate naval engagement in orbit, and, deep within the invading army's command complex, a duel that would be remembered by the few who later understood its true significance, as the moment 1,000 years of careful hiding finally ended. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan confronted Maul together in a long, narrow corridor, lit by energy barriers that rose and fell at irregular intervals, separating the combatants into isolated chambers as the fight progressed. Qui-Gon fought with the calm, measured precision that had defined his entire career, certain now beyond any doubt exactly what he was facing and exactly how dangerous it truly was. He fought to win, and for a long stretch of that brutal exchange, it seemed as though he might. The barrier that separated him from Obi-Wan during the fight's final phase proved fatal. Trapped on the wrong side of an energy wall as it cycled shut, Obi-Wan could only watch as Maul pressed his advantage against Qui-Gon alone, ending the duel with a single decisive strike the moment the barrier finally lifted again. Qui-Gon died within minutes, his last words spent not on regret or fear, but on a single request to his apprentice: care for the boy they had found earlier on that desert world, a child Qui-Gon had sensed unusual strength in the Force, and continued training him as Qui-Gon himself no longer could. Obi-Wan's grief lasted only seconds before fury replaced it entirely. He turned on Maul with an intensity that surprised even himself, driving the fight forward with a recklessness nothing in his training had prepared him for, and ended it the same way Qui-Gon's life had just ended: fast, final, and without ceremony. The Republic, when the dust settled, celebrated the victory at Naboo the way it had celebrated every victory across these settled centuries. A trade dispute resolved through decisive action rather than endless negotiation. Few outside a small circle of Jedi ever fully understood what Qui-Gon had actually sensed, or what his death truly represented. The official reports described Maul simply as an unusually skilled mercenary, dangerous but ultimately defeated, a footnote in an otherwise straightforward military victory. The Council, in the aftermath, debated Qui-Gon's warning more seriously than they had during his life, though even then, the conclusion drawn satisfied caution more than it satisfied truth. One enforcer, however dangerous, did not prove an entire ancient order had survived. Whoever trained him remained unaccounted for. His fate unknown, his existence treated as a troubling possibility rather than a confirmed certainty requiring urgent galaxy-wide action. In the capital, the newly elected Chancellor took his oath of office within days of the battle's end, praised across every news channel as exactly the kind of steady, compassionate leader the Republic needed after such a frightening crisis. He spoke movingly of Naboo's suffering, of the Jedi's sacrifice, of a Republic that had proven, once again, its capacity to act when truly tested. Few in that celebrating crowd understood they were witnessing the final, most patient step of a plan 9 centuries in the making, completed not through conquest, but through an election, conducted entirely within the Republic's own rules, by a man the galaxy had spent 2 decades training itself to trust completely. The danger had finally stepped into the light. Almost no one recognized it, even standing directly beneath it. The new Chancellor governed exactly as everyone had expected him to during his first years in office. Careful, measured, endlessly patient with a Senate that tested everyone's patience by design. Then the galaxy handed him a crisis large enough to require something else entirely, and for the first time since taking his oath, he showed the Republic a version of leadership it hadn't seen from him before. A coalition of disaffected systems, frustrated by years of taxation and Senate gridlock that mirrored exactly the same grievances that had sparked the Naboo blockade a decade earlier, formally declared their intention to separate from the Republic altogether. They called themselves the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and within months their numbers swelled into the thousands, drawing planets from across the galaxy into a movement that threatened to fracture the South Republic for the first time in 1,000 years. War, after centuries spent believing it belonged only to history books, suddenly felt close enough to touch. The Jedi Council, searching for any military advantage that might prevent open conflict, dispatched investigators to track the Separatists' growing droid forces back to their source. That search led, almost by accident, to a discovery no one on the Council had authorized or even known existed: an enormous clone army, already grown to maturity, waiting on a remote ocean world for orders no living Jedi remembered giving. The cloners explained, with evident confusion at the Jedi's surprise, that the order had come a decade earlier from a Jedi Master acting on the Council's behalf. The name attached to that order belonged to a master named Sifo Dyas. Sifo Dyas had died years before the Separatist crisis ever began, killed under circumstances the order had never fully investigated at the time. His absence noted, mourned briefly, and ultimately filed away as one more loss among many, across a long career of service. What almost no one remembered, because almost no one had taken it seriously enough to record carefully, was the warning he had voiced in his final years. A quiet, increasingly urgent insistence to colleagues that something larger than ordinary trade disputes was shaping events across the Republic. Something patient and deliberate that none of their usual tools could detect. He had pushed for military preparation no one else believed necessary. He had been politely overruled, the way warnings like his had been overruled for 9 centuries. And not long after, he simply vanished on a diplomatic mission that never reached its destination. No clone army order existed in any record he left behind. Whoever had actually placed that order, using his name and his authority, had vanished as thoroughly as he had. The Council debated the mystery only briefly, before urgency overtook curiosity entirely. An army existed. A war was beginning, whether anyone wanted it or not. Questions about its true origin would have to wait for a calmer season that, as it turned out, the galaxy would never quite provide again. The first battle came swiftly, on a dry, rust-colored world called Geonosis, where Separatist forces had gathered to mass-produce battle droids in numbers the Republic had no immediate way of matching without the clone army, now suddenly, conveniently available. Jedi, who had spent their entire careers mediating trade disputes and settling border quarrels, found themselves, within the space of a single afternoon, commanding entire divisions of soldiers they had never trained alongside, fighting a war none of them had chosen and few of them felt remotely prepared for. Among the Jedi committed to that first battle was a young man named Anakin Skywalker, talented beyond almost any measure the Order had ever recorded, trained since childhood, under the watchful guidance of Obi-Wan Kenobi. After Qui-Gon's death, years earlier, left that responsibility to him. Anakin's gifts were undeniable. His instincts in the cockpit and on the battlefield bordered on prophetic, his connection to the Force, deeper and more immediate than instructors twice his age could fully account for. His temperament, however, carried a current beneath the brilliance that troubled even those who admired him most. Months before Geonosis, returning to the desert world of his childhood, after a vision of his mother in pain, Anakin had found her dying, captured and tortured by raiders who haunted the region's outer settlements. Her death in his arms broke something in him that the Order's careful, controlled teachings had never quite prepared him to manage. In the grief and fury that followed, he had turned on the raiders' encampment with a violence that went far beyond what any threat to himself required, killing not only the warriors responsible, but everyone present, including those who posed him no danger at all. He confessed this afterward to Obi-Wan, with a rawness that startled them both, ashamed and unrepentant in the same breath. Certain he had done something unforgivable, and equally certain he would do it again under the same circumstances. Obi-Wan reported none of this to the Council in detail. He told himself it was compassion, a desire to protect a grieving young man from judgment he hadn't yet earned the wisdom to survive. Whatever the reason, the warning that should have followed Anakin into the war that began only weeks later simply never reached the people who might have acted on it. At Geonosis, that unchecked fire became, for the first time, a weapon the Republic actively needed. Anakin fought with a ferocity that turned the tide of several engagements single-handedly, charging into droid formations other Jedi instinctively held back from, emerging each time with fewer injuries than logic suggested he should have survived. Soldiers under his command began speaking of him with the particular reverence reserved for commanders who seemed, however briefly, untouchable. Anakin found that reverence intoxicating in ways he didn't yet have the maturity to recognize as dangerous. Leading the broader Republic assault that day was Mace Windu, one of the Council's most senior and formidable members, a Jedi whose own combat skill rivaled anyone in the Order's long history. Windu had argued against committing to open war for as long as argument remained possible, distrustful of how conveniently the clone army had appeared exactly when the Republic needed it most. Once battle became unavoidable, however, he committed to it completely, leading the assault that ultimately broke the separatist droid forces and rescued the captured Jedi the battle had originally been launched to save. Windu watched Anakin fight that day, with a mixture of admiration and unease he found difficult to fully name. The boy's talent was extraordinary, so, increasingly, was the recklessness beneath it. A willingness to court catastrophic risk that looked, from certain angles, less like courage than like a young man searching for something dangerous enough to finally silence whatever was screaming inside him. He said nothing about this to the Council either. There was a war to win now, and wars, as every Jedi quickly relearned across those first chaotic months, left very little room for anything except the next battle's immediate demands. In the months that followed Geonosis, the Jedi Order transformed more completely than it had in 5 centuries, and faster than even its own masters fully registered while it was happening. Temple halls that had filled, for generations, with negotiation training and diplomatic protocol now filled instead with tactical briefings and supply logistics. Padawans graduated early into command roles their training had never fully prepared them for. Masters who had spent decades mediating border disputes found themselves directing entire fleets, coordinating ground assaults across worlds they had never visited and would likely never visit again once the fighting moved elsewhere. The order told itself, repeatedly and with evident sincerity, that this was simply peacekeeping under unusually difficult circumstances, protecting the Republic's citizens from a separatist threat that endangered everything 5 centuries of hard-won stability had built. Few Jedi serving in those early campaigns paused to examine how thoroughly the language itself had shifted beneath them, how casually words like mission and offensive had replaced words like mediation and resolution in their daily vocabulary, how completely an institution built to prevent war had become, within a single year, one of its primary engines. Anakin rose through this transformed order, faster than almost anyone in its long history. Promoted ahead of schedule, trusted with command responsibilities most Jedi twice his age had never been given. He earned that trust honestly, in the narrow sense that his battlefield results consistently justified it. What went largely unexamined was the cost accumulating quietly behind those results. The soldiers he pushed past reasonable limits in pursuit of victories that mattered more to him personally than strategy alone could explain, the growing list of close calls that should have triggered concern rather than admiration, the private fury that surfaced more easily with each campaign, and found, in the chaos of war, ample opportunity to express itself without consequence. Obi-Wan watched his former apprentice change across these years with a worry he rarely voiced aloud, partly out of respect for Anakin's genuine accomplishments, partly out of an exhaustion that war inflicted on everyone serving through it, leaving little energy left over for problems that hadn't yet become emergencies. He told himself, the way Qui-Gon's own warnings had once been told to themselves by an earlier generation of masters, that whatever he was seeing would settle once the war finally ended. The war, surely, couldn't last much longer than the original crisis had suggested. Surely the galaxy would find its footing again, the way it always eventually had. The Chancellor, meanwhile, expanded his authority steadily across these same months, granted emergency powers by a Senate desperate for decisive leadership during a conflict that showed no sign of resolving quickly. Each expansion was modest on its own, justified by immediate wartime necessity, approved with overwhelming majorities by representatives who told themselves, individually and collectively, that extraordinary circumstances simply demanded extraordinary flexibility. Few paused to ask how thoroughly those same emergency powers might outlast the emergency that justified them in the first place. Within the Jedi Temple, a small number of senior masters began, quietly and informally, voicing concerns that the war's true shape didn't quite match its official explanation. The clone army's mysterious origin remained unresolved. The separatist leadership's sudden, well-funded military build-up seemed, to anyone willing to examine it closely, suspiciously well prepared for a movement that supposedly arose from spontaneous grassroots frustration. These concerns surfaced in private conversations, in late-night exchanges between masters too tired from active campaigns to pursue them with the rigor they likely deserved, and then, almost without exception, faded back into the war's relentless daily demands, before anyone managed to formalize them into anything the full council could properly investigate. This, too, was how the pattern had always survived, not through any single failure of vigilance, but through an accumulation of reasonable, individually defensible decisions to address the more urgent thing first, made by exhausted people doing their genuine best within a system that had never quite trained them to recognize patience itself as a weapon. By the close of the war's second year, The Jedi Order bore almost no resemblance to the institution that had entered it. Its membership had grown more militarized with each passing month. Its masters increasingly measured success in territory held and casualties avoided rather than disputes resolved and trust rebuilt. Its youngest and most promising knight had become, in the eyes of soldiers and citizens across a dozen war-torn systems, something closer to a living legend than an ordinary Jedi. Beloved, feared, and increasingly unknown even to the few people who had once known him best, Anakin himself. In the rare quiet moments the war still occasionally allowed him, sometimes wondered what exactly he was becoming. He never lingered on the question long enough to find an answer that satisfied him. There was always another battle waiting, another opportunity to prove himself worthy of the trust everyone kept placing in him, another reason to push the question aside until some calmer season that, much like the war's promised quick resolution, never quite seemed to arrive. Far above all of it, in chambers most of the fighting Jedi never visited and rarely thought about, the man who had engineered every step of the crisis continued accumulating power with the same patience that had defined his entire life. Watching a war he alone fully understood reshape an institution 9 centuries of careful planning had always known would eventually need reshaping. One battle, one promotion, and one unexamined fear at a time. By the war's final year, the young knight who had once stunned the Order with raw talent had become something closer to its most visible symbol, celebrated across a dozen war fronts, trusted with commands no one his age had ever held, and quietly, privately married to a senator whose existence he had hidden from the council that governed every other part of his life. That marriage, born years earlier from a connection neither of them had been able to set aside, no matter how thoroughly their lives demanded they should, gave Anakin something the war had never managed to take from him completely. A single, fragile place where he still felt fully himself rather than the legend everyone else had started treating him as. It also gave him something far more dangerous than comfort. It gave him something left to lose. The dreams began without warning, months before the war's final campaigns. In them, Padme died, always in childbirth, always in ways Anakin's waking mind couldn't fully separate from memory once he opened his eyes each morning. He had seen his mother die once already, helpless to stop it, despite every ounce of power he possessed. The dreams insisted, with a cruelty no logic could fully dismiss, that he was about to lose everything that mattered to him a second time, just as helplessly as the first. He told no one in the Order about the dreams. There was no one left by that point in the war who felt entirely safe to tell. Obi-Wan remained his closest friend, but friendship and confession had grown harder to separate from professional duty across years of shared command. And Anakin feared, more than he admitted even to himself, what the Council might decide to do with a knight whose private terror had grown this large. There was one person, however, who had spent years making himself available for exactly this kind of confession. Palpatine's friendship with Anakin had deepened steadily across the war, built patiently from the same quiet attentiveness that had once won him an entire Senate's trust. He asked after Anakin's well-being in ways the Council rarely bothered to. He listened without judgment to frustrations Anakin couldn't voice anywhere else. Resentment toward a Council that withheld full trust, even as it demanded full sacrifice, exhaustion with a war that seemed designed never quite to end. A growing sense that the Jedi's careful philosophy of detachment had less to offer a man genuinely terrified of losing the person he loved than Palpatine's warmer, more human sympathy did. None of this felt sinister to Anakin. It felt, for years, like simple kindness from an old friend who happened to occupy considerable power, the same way it had felt to a queen and a senate a decade earlier. One evening, late in the war, sitting together in a near-empty theater box, while a performance neither of them was fully watching unfolded below. Palpatine told him a story. It concerned, he said, a Sith Lord of immense power and even greater patience, a master of an ancient and dangerous discipline, who had eventually learned secrets the rest of the galaxy assumed simply didn't exist. This Sith Lord, Palpatine explained, had grown wise enough in the ways of the Force to influence the building blocks of life itself, to create life from nothing, and, most remarkably, to prevent the people he cared about from dying at all. Anakin listened with an intensity that surprised even him. He could actually stop someone from dying, the dark side of the Force, Palpatine said, his voice carrying the particular warmth of a man sharing forbidden knowledge with someone he trusted completely, is a path to abilities many would consider unnatural. This Sith Lord became so powerful, the only thing he feared was losing that power. He could keep the ones he cared about from dying. What happened to him? Palpatine allowed a long, careful pause before answering, the kind he had spent a lifetime learning exactly how to hold. His own apprentice killed him in his sleep. Ironic. He could save others from death, but not himself. He let the story sit there, unfinished in all the ways that mattered, watching Anakin's expression carefully, for exactly the reaction he had spent years cultivating the conditions for. Anakin didn't ask the obvious next question that night. He didn't need to. The seed Palpatine had spent a decade preparing the soil for had finally been planted directly, and both of them understood it without saying so aloud. The war itself, throughout these final months, had become something closer to theater than genuine conflict, though almost no one fighting it recognized the distinction. A cybernetic separatist commander named Grievous led increasingly desperate campaigns against Republic forces, his droid armies thinning with each engagement, even as new battles kept appearing across the galaxy, with a regularity that, to anyone examining it carefully, looked almost choreographed. Few Jedi had the time or distance to examine anything that carefully anymore. There was always another front, another crisis, another reason to trust that the war's overall direction remained someone else's responsibility to manage. In recognition of his growing stature, the Council made Anakin a rare and unusual offer, a seat among their number, an honor few knights his age had ever received. They withheld, in the same breath, the full rank of master that traditionally accompanied such a seat, citing procedure, citing his relative youth, citing concerns about precedent that several masters privately admitted, only to each other, were really concerns about something else entirely. An instinct, never fully articulated, that something about this particular knight's temperament made full trust feel premature, no matter how impressive his record had become. Anakin received the partial honor as precisely the insult it was designed not to be. He had given the order everything across years of relentless war, and the moment that service finally earned him a seat at its highest table, that same order found a way to remind him he still wasn't fully one of them. The humiliation lodged itself somewhere deep enough that no later apology, had one ever come, would likely have fully dislodged it. Worse followed within weeks, sensing growing tension between the Chancellor and the war-weary Senate, and increasingly suspicious of Palpatine's accumulating emergency powers. The Council assigned Anakin to monitor his old friend directly, reporting back anything that might suggest the Chancellor intended to overstep the authority the Senate had granted him. They framed the assignment as an honor, evidence of trust in his unique closeness to the Chancellor. Anakin understood it, correctly, as something closer to exploitation, being used as an instrument against the one person in his life who had never once made him feel like an instrument. He accepted the assignment anyway, the way a soldier accepts an order he privately resents, and began reporting back, with growing reluctance, conversations he increasingly wished he didn't have to share with anyone. Mace Windu, watching all of this unfold from his position at the council's center, had grown suspicious of Palpatine for reasons that extended well beyond institutional caution. Fragmented intelligence gathered across the war's final year, coded references in captured separatist communications, inconsistencies in the clone army's mysterious origin that finally connected, after years of neglect, to a pattern someone disciplined enough might have traced, began pointing, with increasing and uncomfortable clarity, toward a single, almost unthinkable conclusion. The ancient enemy the Order had spent 1,000 years believing extinct might not simply have returned. It might have spent decades sitting at the exact center of the Republic's own government, hiding behind the most ordinary, most trusted face the galaxy could have offered it. Windu kept this suspicion close, sharing it with only a small circle of senior masters, aware of exactly how thoroughly such an accusation, voiced too early or too publicly, could unravel an institution already strained past anything it had endured in 5 centuries. He moved carefully, gathering what evidence remained available, preparing, in the war's final desperate weeks, to act the moment certainty finally arrived. It arrived faster than he expected, and from a source he hadn't anticipated. Anakin, torn for months between loyalty to a council that had never fully trusted him, and gratitude toward a mentor who always had, finally broke under the weight of everything he had been carrying privately. The dreams of Padmé's death, Palpatine's quiet promise of a path that might prevent it, the Council's persistent, wounding withholding of full faith in him, no matter what he sacrificed to earn it. In a moment of desperate confession, hoping against hope that his old friend might somehow share the secret that could save the person he loved, Anakin told Palpatine of his fears directly, and asked, finally, the question the theater conversation had been built to provoke months earlier. Could the dark side truly stop someone from dying? Palpatine's answer, delivered with the same patient warmth he had spent a decade perfecting, was the truth at last, stripped of metaphor. He was, he confessed, the very Sith Lord the old story had described, not merely its narrator, but its subject, the master of a tradition stretching back nearly 1,000 years, patient enough to have shaped the war itself, patient enough to have shaped Anakin's entire life, without Anakin ever fully realizing he was being shaped at all. He offered, in the same breath as this confession, exactly what Anakin most desperately wanted, the power to save Padmé, the power his fear had been begging someone, anyone, to grant him for months. Anakin recoiled from the revelation, horrified, torn between everything he had been taught and everything he now desperately wanted to believe was possible. He fled the chamber and went, in genuine anguish, directly to Mace Windu, reporting at last the full truth the Council had been circling for weeks without quite reaching. The Chancellor was the Sith Lord they had been searching for. Windu moved immediately, gathering a small group of senior masters to arrest Palpatine before he could react to the exposure. Anakin, asked to remain behind, agreed, though something in him, fear, loyalty, the desperate unfinished hope that Palpatine's offer might still somehow be real, refused to fully settle. The confrontation, when it came, ended in violence within minutes. Palpatine, cornered, revealed a level of combat skill no one in the Order had imagined the gentle, unassuming Chancellor capable of possessing, cutting down the Masters, who had come to arrest him with a ferocity matching anything Anakin himself had ever displayed in battle. Only Windu remained standing by the duel's end, locked in a desperate exchange against an opponent whose true nature was, at last, fully and undeniably exposed. Anakin arrived in the chamber's final moments, drawn back by an instinct he couldn't fully name, just as Windu finally gained the upper hand, disarming Palpatine and preparing to end 1,000 years of patient hiding, with a single decisive strike. What happened next would be argued over, in the small circles that ever learned the full truth, for the rest of galactic history. Watching the only path he believed could save Padme about to be permanently severed, intervened. He struck Windu's arm before the killing blow could land, giving Palpatine the single opening he needed to finish what Windu had nearly ended himself. Windu died in that chamber, the last and most senior defender of an order that had, in its final desperate hour, finally seen its true enemy clearly, too late, by the width of a single intervention, to stop him. Palpatine turned to Anakin in the silence that followed, breathing hard, his disguise fully gone now, nothing left of the gentle Chancellor's face in the expression he wore. He offered, one final time, everything he had spent decades promising: power, knowledge, a path that might, even now, still save the woman Anakin loved. Anakin knelt before him. What rose afterward bore his old name only in the records that hadn't yet been rewritten. Within the tradition that had shaped this entire moment across 9 centuries of patient cultivation, he received a new one, the way every apprentice before him had, going back to a cold afternoon on a forest moon almost no one alive could still locate on a star chart. From that night forward, he was Darth Vader, the 1,000 years of careful, patient hiding that had built toward exactly this moment had, at last, found its full and complete expression, not in an army, not in a battlefield, but in the private despair of one frightened young man, offered exactly the promise his fear most needed to hear, at exactly the moment his trust in every other institution in his life had finally, completely run out. Somewhere across the galaxy, in temples and command posts on 100 different worlds, soldiers who had fought beside their Jedi commanders for 3 years, carried, embedded quietly in their training, from the very beginning, a final order none of them yet knew they would soon receive. The night that order finally came would arrive within hours. The order embedded quietly in every soldier's training reached them within hours of Windu's death, transmitted in a single coded phrase that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent years preparing, unknowingly, to receive it. Across 100 different worlds, in the same impossible instant, soldiers who had fought beside their Jedi commanders for 3 straight years turned their weapons on them without warning, without hesitation, and without a single one of them understanding why beyond the simple, absolute certainty that the order had to be obeyed. Different planets, different battles, the same transmission arriving in every soldier's ear within seconds of each other, carried by a chip, embedded so deeply in their training that none of them experienced it as a choice at all. It simply was. The way breathing simply was, beyond question, beyond hesitation. On a jungle world thick with ancient trees, a Jedi general who had spent the war earning the genuine trust of the soldiers serving under him, fell mid-sentence, cut down by men who had carried him from danger more times than either side could count. He never finished the order he was giving. On a frozen battlefield far across the galaxy, a young Jedi Knight barely out of her Padawan training turned at the sound of blaster fire behind her, certain for one disbelieving instant that the shot must have been an accident, before the second and third shots removed any possibility of mistaking what was happening. On a desert world thick with old wreckage from earlier battles, an aging master who had trained 3 generations of clone commanders personally died, facing soldiers he had taught to fight, his lightsaber never leaving its place at his belt, unable in his final seconds to fully believe the betrayal his own senses were screaming at him to accept. On an ocean world where a small Jedi outpost had spent months coordinating naval patrols against separatist raiders, a commander who had spent that same time teaching local cadets the basics of starfighter maneuvers died in the same hangar bay where, only hours earlier, he had been laughing with 3 of those same cadets about a maintenance mishap none of them had taken seriously at the time. Not every Jedi died in that first wave. Some sensed the shift in the Force an instant before the shots came, and managed, narrowly, to escape into hiding, scattering across the galaxy's farthest, least watched corners, with nothing left but whatever skills and convictions they had carried out the door with them. Most did not. By the time the Order had finished propagating across every front of a war that had spread the Order thinner than at any point in its long history, the overwhelming majority of Jedi serving the Republic were already dead, killed by soldiers who had called them General with genuine respect only hours earlier. On Coruscant, the Order's final and most symbolic target waited at the heart of the city that had served as the Order's home for 1,000 years. Vader arrived at the Jedi Temple personally, leading a contingent of soldiers through halls that had, only days earlier, still echoed faintly with the careful, diplomatic rhythms of an institution that once believed itself fundamentally a peacekeeping body, rather than a military one. Whatever remained of that older identity ended within those walls that night. Younglings too young to have completed even basic training, masters caught off guard, in meditation chambers never designed to be defended, archivists and healers who had spent the war serving the Order in ways that had nothing to do with combat at all. None of it mattered to what moved through the temple that night. The fighting, where there was any fighting at all, lasted only minutes in most chambers. In several, it didn't happen at all, replaced instead by a silence that settled over rooms full of people who had simply stopped, all at once, the way the survivors of an ancient battle on a forest moon had once stopped 9 centuries earlier. The temple's lower archives, where a research assistant had once catalogued a missing name from an old muster roll, generations before any of this night's participants were born, burned along with everything else, taking with it whatever fragments of that earlier mystery still remained on file. No one left alive that night would ever think to ask what had been lost in that particular fire, since almost no one left alive that night knew the question had ever mattered in the first place. By the time the temple's distress signal finally reached the handful of Jedi commanders still alive and uncompromised across the galaxy, the building itself had already gone quiet in the particular way buildings go quiet once everyone inside them has stopped moving. On the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk, fighting alongside clone troopers in a campaign that had occupied him for weeks, Master Yoda felt the deaths arrive in the Force, like a wave breaking against everything he had spent 9 centuries learning to sense clearly. Hundreds, then thousands of familiar presences extinguished within the same few hours, each one a student he had trained or a colleague he had served alongside, gone with a suddenness that left even his ancient, carefully disciplined awareness reeling. The soldiers beside him, receiving the same order that had already claimed so many of his fellow Jedi, turned their own weapons on him, within moments of the signal reaching their ranks. He survived only because 900 years of training had prepared him, in ways nothing else in the galaxy could have, to recognize danger and respond to it faster than thought itself. In that short time, something close to genuine respect from him, fired without a flicker of hesitation visible anywhere in his expression. There was nothing personal in it. There had never been room left for anything personal in what that soldier had been built, from the very beginning, to eventually become. Yoda understood this even as he moved to defend himself, and the understanding made the moment no less devastating to live through. On the sinkhole world of Utapau, hunting the last significant separatist commander in a campaign meant to finally end a war that had somehow always seemed designed never quite to end, Obi-Wan Kenobi felt the same wave arrive, distant but unmistakable, a tearing in the Force he had never once imagined feeling on this scale. His own escort, soldiers who had served under him with what felt like genuine loyalty for years, turned on him in the same instant their counterparts elsewhere were turning on every other Jedi still standing. He survived only through a narrow, desperate escape that left him alone, hunted, and uncertain for the first time in his adult life whether the order he had served his entire life still existed in any meaningful sense at all. It did not, though confirming that fully would take both surviving masters several more desperate hours. Yoda, reaching Coruscant in secret aboard a borrowed ship, found the temple exactly as the distress signal silence had warned him it would be. Fires still burning in several wings, bodies left where they had fallen. A building that had stood at the center of galactic history for 1,000 years, now standing empty of almost everything that had ever given it purpose. He altered the temple's beacon signal himself, transmitting a warning to any surviving Jedi still making their way back toward what they believed was still a sanctuary, redirecting them away from a trap that would otherwise have claimed whatever few of them remained. He went from there directly to the Senate, sensing with absolute certainty exactly who had orchestrated everything he had just witnessed, and exactly where that architect could currently be found. The confrontation in the Senate chamber that followed would be remembered by the handful of beings who ever learned its full details, as the closest the galaxy came that night to undoing what had already been set irreversibly in motion. Yoda fought with a ferocity 9 centuries of careful restraint had rarely required him to display, matching an opponent whose true power, fully unleashed for the first time in 1,000 years of patient concealment, proved formidable beyond almost anything Yoda's long life had prepared him to face. The duel tore through the chamber's massive speaking platforms, each combatant pressing every advantage centuries of training had given them, neither fully able to overcome the other through skill alone. Senatorial pods built to carry peaceful debate across 1,000 worlds shattered and fell into the chamber's depths as the fight surged across them. The great room's usual hum of bureaucratic procedure replaced, for the only time in its long history, by the sound of 2 ancient traditions finally meeting in open combat, after 9 centuries of one pretending the other no longer existed. In the end, not skill that decided the outcome, but the same patient arithmetic that had decided every confrontation across this entire 1,000-year tradition. One side had spent 9 centuries hiding, planning, and waiting specifically for this moment. The other had spent those same centuries believing, with diminishing but never fully extinguished confidence, that the moment would never arrive at all. Yoda, exhausted from a duel that had already tested him beyond anything in his long memory, finally recognized what continuing the fight would actually cost, and made the only choice his 900 years of wisdom left available to him. He withdrew, not in defeat exactly, though it would be remembered that way by the few who ever heard the story, in recognition that an order built to protect the galaxy had, in this single devastating night, lost the war it hadn't fully understood it was fighting, until the war was already over. What remained worth protecting now wasn't a temple, or an institution, or even the handful of scattered survivors still hiding across a galaxy that no longer had any safe place left for them. What remained was a different kind of hope entirely, one Yoda sensed forming in the Force even in the depths of that catastrophic night, faint, distant, and not yet ready to be acted upon by anyone, least of all himself. Obi-Wan, meanwhile, had learned by then the full shape of what had actually happened to his former apprentice. The trail led him to a volcanic world called Mustafar, where separatist leadership had been gathered, and, in the war's final act of manufactured tragedy, executed personally by the same young man Obi-Wan had trained from childhood, now serving an entirely different master than the one Obi-Wan had spent years believing he was raising him to serve. What followed between them in that volcanic landscape was not, in any meaningful sense, a battle between 2 Jedi. It was the final, devastating collision between everything Obi-Wan had once hoped his apprentice might become, and everything fear, manipulation, and 1,000 years of patient cultivation had actually made of him instead. They fought with a desperation neither had ever shown each other in years of fighting side by side. Old bonds curdling into something neither could fully separate from grief, even as the duel pushed them both toward its inevitable, terrible conclusion. Obi-Wan called out to him more than once during that fight. Not as a soldier addressing an enemy, but as a teacher still desperately hoping some fragment of the student he had trained might still be reachable. Beneath everything Palpatine's decade of patient courtship had buried, no answer came that resembled the boy Obi-Wan remembered. Only the fight continued, each exchange carrying them further from any version of this moment either of them could have imagined existing only weeks earlier. Obi-Wan won, in the narrow sense that he survived, and his former apprentice did not entirely. What remained of Anakin Skywalker after that duel was burned beyond recognition, broken in ways no medical care could fully undo, saved from death only by intervention from the same master who had orchestrated everything leading to that moment in the first place. The man who emerged from that intervention, encased from that day forward in armor built as much to keep him alive as to announce what he had become, bore almost nothing of the young Jedi Obi-Wan had once trained, with genuine hope for what he might accomplish. Obi-Wan left Mustafar, believing his former apprentice had died there completely. In the most important sense, the sense that would have mattered most to the boy he had once known, he wasn't entirely wrong. He and Yoda met afterward, in a location neither would ever fully record, carrying between them the full weight of everything that had just ended. There was little left to discuss that words could meaningfully address. 1,000 years of history, carefully preserved across 9 centuries of institutional memory, had collapsed within the space of a single night into something that would need to survive now, not in temples or records, but in the patient, careful keeping of 2 exhausted survivors who understood, perhaps better than anyone left alive, exactly how thoroughly patience itself had just been weaponized against everything they had spent their lives protecting. They made their choices separately in the days that followed, each carrying forward a piece of what remained. One would vanish into exile on a remote, forgotten world, carrying centuries of accumulated wisdom into a solitude that would last the rest of his long life, watching and waiting for a hope he could not yet fully name but trusted, with the same patience his entire tradition had once taught generations of Jedi to value. Would eventually arrive when the galaxy was finally ready to receive it. The other would take on a quieter, more painful burden still, watching over a child born into circumstances neither he nor anyone else could yet fully explain. A boy delivered into the keeping of a moisture-farming family, on a desert world far from anywhere anyone searching for him would think to look, while his twin sister found a different kind of safety entirely, raised within a senator's household that had, only recently, lost its own queen to circumstances the galaxy would spend years quietly speculating about and never fully understand. Obi-Wan took up a solitary watch on that desert world, close enough to protect the boy he had sworn to guard, but distant enough never to risk drawing the kind of attention that had ended everything else he had ever loved. He told himself, in the long, quiet years that followed, that this single fragile thread was worth everything else that had been lost to preserve it. Most nights, watching twin suns set over an empty horizon, he found he mostly believed it. The man who had orchestrated all of it addressed a Senate still reeling from reports of what it was already calling, with the particular speed governments find for converting catastrophe into approved language, a Jedi rebellion. He spoke of betrayal narrowly averted, of an ancient order revealed at last as a danger to the very republic it had claimed for centuries to serve, of the need, now, in this moment of crisis, for a government strong enough to ensure such a betrayal could never threaten the galaxy again. Senators who had spent decades watching him patiently smooth over disputes, build coalitions, and earn exactly the kind of trust no one in that chamber had ever thought to question, listened to him now, with the same faith they had extended to him for 20 years, never once connecting the calm, reasonable man addressing them to anything resembling the danger he claimed to be protecting them from. The Senate, exhausted by years of war, frightened by reports it had no independent way of verifying, and grateful beyond measure for a leader who seemed, once again, capable of decisive action in a moment of genuine crisis, granted him exactly what he asked for: a new government, a new order, an empire, declared not through conquest but through the same patient, legal, overwhelmingly approved process that had elevated him to power in the first place. The vote passed by an overwhelming margin, applause rolling through the chamber, in waves that lasted long enough for several aides afterward to describe it, without irony, as the loudest celebration the Senate floor had witnessed in living memory. Few in that chamber, cheering the announcement with the particular relief of people desperate to believe a long nightmare had finally ended, understood they were witnessing the final, complete unveiling of something 9 centuries old. That same night, in the lower levels of the city below, the Jedi Temple's tallest spire finally collapsed. The fire that had been consuming it for hours, finally reaching the structural supports that had held the building upright since long before any living person's grandparents had been born. The collapse sent a final plume of smoke and ash into a sky already thick with the haze of a city that had spent the entire day too occupied with its own confusion and relief to notice much of anything happening above it. By the time the spire fell completely, the funeral barges that should have carried the dead away had already lifted off and gone, their pilots too overwhelmed by the scale of what they had just witnessed to do anything but fly, as fast as their ships allowed, away from a building none of them fully understood how to mourn. Below, in the streets and transit stations and apartment towers stretching out beneath the burning temple, the city continued moving the way cities always continue moving, even on nights that will later be remembered as the hinge. An entire era's history finally turned on. No one in those streets looked up. Most of them had no reason to. The official reports that would circulate in the following days described a contained incident, an isolated structural failure connected to recent unrest, nothing requiring public concern. Most citizens accepted this, the way most citizens had accepted most things, across 5 centuries of settled, comfortable peace, not because they were foolish, but because nothing in their entire lives had ever trained them to expect anything different. This was the image that had opened this story, 900 years and 10 chapters earlier, before any of the history that explained it had been told. A burning spire, a city that didn't look up, a silence that felt, even without context, older than the smoke rising above it. It is fully explained now. The forest moon, where one survivor walked away from a war everyone else believed had ended completely. The centuries of patient lessons taught in storage units and converted freight depots, while an entire civilization learned to call its own comfort permanent. A Jedi diplomat who never thought to ask who truly controlled the trade combine sitting across the table from him. The trade reforms born from a victory that taught certain interests exactly how much room a frightened government leaves unguarded. A research assistant who filled a blank space in an old muster roll with a single word, presumed, never imagining how much that word was quietly covering for. The senator no one thought to investigate, because reliable, by definition, never seemed worth investigating. A fisheries dispute settled fairly, a colleague mentioned once in passing, a question raised at a council session, and never followed up on. The war that reshaped an order, built to keep peace, into one that had, by its final year, stopped fully recognizing the difference between keeping peace and waging it. A master who suspected something larger was moving beneath the surface of an ordinary trade dispute, dead before he could finish proving it. The fear, the promise, and the private despair of one frightened young man offered exactly the answer his terror most needed to hear. At exactly the moment every other voice in his life had finally gone silent. None of it had required force, in the sense the galaxy had spent 1,000 years training itself to watch for. No invading fleet, no declared war against the Republic itself. Only patience, applied with a precision few institutions in galactic history had ever managed to sustain across so many generations, waiting for exactly the right comfort to exploit at exactly the right moment, certain, correctly, as it turned out, that a galaxy taught to stop watching for danger would never think to look for it in the one place it had been hiding the entire time. Had finally completed the shape it had been patiently building toward for 900 years. It did not announce itself when it arrived. It never had. It simply stood, fully formed at last, in the one place a galaxy exhausted from centuries of believing itself safe had finally stopped looking. 900 years separated a forest moon's quiet survivor from a temple's final burning spire, and across every one of those years, the same simple, unspoken question had waited patiently for an answer nobody in power ever thought urgent enough to ask. Why does comfort always leave the same door unguarded? Why does peace, given enough centuries to settle, always eventually forget the one lesson war was supposed to have taught it permanently? No senator asked it. No Jedi Council session ever placed it formally on an agenda. The timeline itself became the only answer the question would ever receive, written not in any single record, but in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small, reasonable decisions made by people who had every right to believe, at the time, that they were choosing safety. No one wrote the pattern down. In the end, no official report ever named it. No historian, in the years that followed, fully connected a forest moon's quiet survivor to a burning temple's final collapse, though the line between them had never once broken across 9 centuries of patient, unbroken cultivation. Somewhere on a desert world far from the capital, a small boy, too young to remember any of it, slept through that same night, in the home of a moisture farmer and his wife, entirely unaware of the weight already settling quietly around the edges of his life. Somewhere else, in a household still mourning a lost queen, a girl just as young slept just as peacefully, equally unaware that the thread connecting her to everything this story had just finished telling would not surface again for nearly 20 more years. Neither child carried any memory of a forest moon, a settled galaxy, an architect's patient decades, or a final, devastating choice made in a Senate chamber 2 days earlier. Between them, without either child knowing it yet, rested whatever answer the galaxy's oldest unspoken question would eventually receive. The fire went out eventually, the way fires always eventually do. What it left behind didn't need announcing. The silence afterward said everything the smoke itself never could.